I'm Michelle Torres. I've been working the Denali backcountry for 8 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at you, whether that changes in minutes, wildlife encounters, lost hikers who wandered off marked trails thinking they knew better. But what I found at mile marker 47 on the Richardson Creek Access Road in July of 2015 still sits heavy in my chest. Even now, it was a Tuesday morning, early shift. I was making my usual rounds, checking the dispersed camping areas along the creek, when I noticed the blue sedan parked at the pullout near marker 47. Nothing unusual about that. It's a popular spot for families. Close enough to the road that you don't need serious hiking gear, but far enough in to feel like you're really camping. The Washington state plates caught my eye, and I made a mental note to swing by later and make sure they had their permits in order. I had 3 other sites to check first. Routine stuff. A group of college kids who'd been partying too loud the night before. An elderly couple from Texas who wanted to know about bear safety for the 100th time. By the time I made it back to mile marker 47, it was just past noon, and the sun was high enough to cut through the canopy in those long, slanted rays that make the woods look almost cathedral-like. That's when I noticed the smell. Not anything alarming, just the scent of cooked food drifting through the trees. Bacon, maybe eggs, made my stomach growl since I'd skipped breakfast to get an early start. I followed the scent down the narrow trail that leads from the pullout to the designated camping spots along the creek bank. The campsite was set up perfectly. Blue dome tent positioned to catch the morning sun, but sheltered from the prevailing wind. Camp chairs arranged around a fire ring that still had a few wisps of smoke curling up from it. A camp stove sitting on the picnic table with a cast iron pan still on the burner. When I got close enough, I could see scrambled eggs in the pan, still steaming. A package of bacon sat open beside it, 3 strips missing. I called out, "Hello? Anyone here? This is Ranger Torres with the Park Service." Nothing but the sound of Richardson Creek flowing past and the wind moving through the spruce trees. I walked the perimeter of the site, looking for the family. Sometimes people go down to the water to wash dishes, or kids wander off looking for interesting rocks. But their camp shoes were lined up neatly beside the tent. 3 pairs adult hiking boots, smaller women's sneakers, and tiny pink sandals that couldn't have belonged to anyone older than 5 or 6. Car keys sat on the picnic table next to 2 wallets and a purse, along with cell phones in a neat row. That's when the wrongness of it really hit me. People don't leave their wallets behind when they go explore. They don't leave their keys sitting out where anyone could take them. And they sure don't leave breakfast cooking on the stove. I turned off the camp stove and touched the pan still warm enough that the eggs hadn't started to congeal. The tent was zipped shut. I called out again, thinking maybe someone was napping inside, but got no response. Following protocol, I announced myself clearly and unzipped the door. Empty, but not just empty, deliberately arranged. 3 sleeping bags laid out side by side, unzipped and spread flat, like someone had just gotten up and smoothed them out. Clothes folded in neat stacks at the foot of each bag. A small stuffed rabbit sitting upright on one of the pillows, its button eyes staring toward the tent opening. I've processed hundreds of campsites over the years, and you develop an eye for how people live in temporary spaces. There's always a certain organized chaos stuff pulled out of bags, clothes draped over camp chairs, toiletries scattered on the table. This looked like a display in a camping store. Everything in its place, everything clean and purposeful. I backed out of the tent and took inventory of the site again. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture or scattered belongings. The fire had burned down naturally. Food was still in the cooler, all of it properly sealed and organized. Even their trash was bagged and tied, ready to be packed out. I radioed dispatch and reported a possible missing family, then started the search protocol. Walked the creek bank in both directions, calling out. Checked the obvious places people might wander, the swimming hole downstream, the overlook trail that branches off about a quarter-mile up. Found nothing. No footprints in the soft ground by the water. No broken branches or disturbed vegetation off the main paths. When my supervisor arrived with backup, we expanded the search. Called in a helicopter from Fairbanks. Got some volunteers from the local search and rescue unit. We went over that area for 3 days. Grid pattern search extending 2 miles in every direction from the campsite. Found nothing. Not a single trace. The Washington State Patrol ran the plates for us. Car belonged to David Chen. Address in Seattle. We called the emergency contact number from his wallet, his sister in Spokane. She told us David had taken his wife, Sarah, and their daughter, Emma, age 6, on a 2-week Alaska camping trip. They'd been planning it for months, had all their permits, proper gear, even bear spray. David was an experienced outdoorsman, she said. Eagle Scout, wilderness first aid certified. The kind of guy who researches everything twice and packs backup gear for his backup gear. The family had checked into their hotel in Anchorage 4 days earlier, according to credit card records. Bought supplies at a sporting goods store, filled up with gas, and driven north. The hotel clerk remembered them nice family, excited about their first trip to Alaska. The little girl had been wearing the same pink sandals we found at the campsite. We processed the scene as thoroughly as any crime scene, but there wasn't much to process. No fingerprints except theirs on their own belongings. No disturbance in the surrounding area. The food in the cooler was still cold when we found it, which meant they couldn't have been gone more than a few hours when I arrived. The case file sits in the missing persons database. 3 people who simply vanished between breakfast and noon on a clear July day, leaving behind everything they owned, including the shoes on their feet. The official theory is that they went for a hike and got lost, maybe fell into the creek and were swept downstream. But David Chen's sister insists he would never have left camp without locking the car and securing their valuables. And I've never seen anyone arrange their belongings so carefully before disappearing into the wilderness. I drive that stretch of the Richardson Creek Road at least twice a week as part of my regular patrol. Mile marker 47 still gets camping traffic, families with kids, couples on weekend getaways, the usual mix of visitors trying to find a piece of Alaska's wild places. I always slow down when I pass the pullout. Always check to make sure whoever's camping there looks normal and settled and temporary in the way camping should look. Sometimes, when the light hits the trees just right and the wind carries the scent of a campfire through my open window, I find myself thinking about that cast iron pan with breakfast still steaming in it, about 3 sleeping bags laid out like someone had just smoothed them down before walking away, about a little girl's pink sandals lined up so perfectly beside a tent that was zipped shut from the inside. I think about how quiet it was that day, and how the quiet didn't feel peaceful the way mountain quiet usually does. It felt expectant, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, or maybe waiting for something that had already happened to be discovered. The Chen family is still listed as missing. It's been 9 years now. Emma would be 15, probably thinking about getting her driver's license and worrying about high school instead of whatever happened to her in those woods. Sometimes I wonder if they're still out there somewhere, if they found something in the wilderness that made them decide to stay. But when I'm being honest with myself, usually late at night when the forest sounds seem louder than they should, I think they found something else entirely. Something that made them line up their shoes and fold their clothes and zip their tent shut from the inside before walking away from everything they'd ever known, including themselves. I'm David Kim, and I've been working wildlife management in the Chugach National Forest for 14 years. Most of that time, I've been tracking animal movements, collecting data on migration patterns, maintaining remote cameras. It's quiet work that suits me fine. You learn to read the forest differently when you spend your days thinking like the animals that live in it, where they go, why they go there, what makes them change their patterns. In September of 2018, I got pulled into a search and rescue operation for a missing hiker named Sarah Kellerman, 28 years old, from Portland. Experienced backpacker, according to her emergency contacts. She'd been solo hiking the Crow Pass Trail and was supposed to check in with her sister every other day. When 4 days passed without contact, the sister called it in. Sarah had been hiking a section I knew well. I'd been running a study on Dall sheep movements in that area for 3 years. I'd placed cameras along several of the game trails that intersect with the hiking routes, so I volunteered to help with the search and to pull the footage from my equipment to see if we'd captured anything useful. The search coordinator divided the area into grids, and I took the sections where I had cameras placed. It's rough country up there, steep ridges, dense stands of spruce and hemlock, creeks that can turn into torrents if the weather changes. Plenty of places for someone to get turned around or injured, even someone with experience. I spent 2 days covering my assigned area, checking the cameras and hiking every trail and game path I could find. The weather had been clear when Sarah went missing, so tracking conditions were decent. But I didn't find any sign of her, no footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no gear left behind. The cameras from that week showed the usual wildlife activity. Sheep moving along their traditional routes. A few black bears. Some ptarmigan. No human figures. On the 3rd day of the search, we got the call that changed everything. Sarah had walked out on her own. She'd emerged from the forest near the Eagle River Nature Center, about 15 miles from where her car was parked at the Crow Pass trailhead. A family visiting the center spotted her coming out of the tree line just after sunrise, moving slow but steady. They said she looked dehydrated and exhausted, but she was walking under her own power and seemed coherent. I was part of the team that responded to transport her to the medical station. When I arrived, Sarah was sitting on a bench outside the nature center, still wearing her hiking gear. Her backpack was intact, her gear all accounted for. She'd lost some weight and was clearly dehydrated, but considering she'd been missing for 6 days in the wilderness, she looked remarkably good. The first thing I noticed was how she kept looking over her shoulder at the tree line she'd emerged from. Not occasional glances, but constant, quick looks, like she was checking to make sure nothing was following her. Her hiking boots were worn, but not excessively so. Her clothes were dirty, but not torn. For someone who'd supposedly been lost in dense forest for nearly a week, she showed remarkably little damage. The EMTs were checking her vitals and asking standard questions. Where had she been? Was she injured? Did she remember how she got separated from the trail? Sarah answered most of their questions clearly enough, but she kept saying she couldn't remember much about the past 6 days. She remembered starting the hike, remembered setting up camp the first night, but after that, everything was fuzzy. That's when the apologies started. At first, I thought she was just being polite, thanking the search team for looking for her. But as we prepared to transport her to the hospital for a full evaluation, she kept saying she was sorry. Not sorry for causing trouble or worry, but just sorry, repeated over and over, with this urgent tone like she needed us to understand something specific. "I'm sorry," she said as we helped her into the rescue vehicle. "I'm really sorry. I didn't know it would follow me back." The EMT asked what she meant. What had followed her back? Sarah looked at him with this expression. I still can't shake part confusion, part fear, part guilt. She said she wasn't sure, that she couldn't remember clearly, but something had come back with her from wherever she'd been. During the ride to the hospital, she kept apologizing. To me, to the EMT, to the search coordinator who was documenting the incident, always the same phrase. She was sorry for bringing it back. When we asked what it was, she'd get this distant look and say she couldn't explain it, couldn't remember exactly, but she knew something was wrong. The hospital evaluation found her to be in surprisingly good condition, considering the circumstances. Dehydrated, mildly malnourished, some minor scratches and bruises consistent with moving through heavy forest, but no serious injuries, no signs of trauma, no evidence of assault or animal attack. Her memory loss regarding the missing days was attributed to stress and dehydration. Her family came up from Portland to take her home, and I figured that would be the end of it. Another search and rescue with a positive outcome, which is always something to be grateful for. But about 2 weeks later, I started noticing changes in the wildlife patterns in the area where Sarah had emerged. The Dall sheep had abandoned their traditional routes through that section. My camera stopped recording the usual animal activity. No bears, no small game, even the bird population seemed different. It wasn't dramatic, nothing you'd notice unless you'd been studying the area for years. But the animals were avoiding something. I hiked up to the location where Sarah had come out of the forest, following the rough path her footprints had left. The trail led back into thick timber, winding through areas where no established path existed. I followed it for about 2 miles before it simply disappeared in a dense stand of spruce trees. No signs of where she'd camped, no gear left behind, no evidence of how she'd survived 6 days with no clear water source or shelter. But there was something else. The trees in that area looked different. Not damaged exactly, but changed. The bark on some of the larger spruces had a strange, smooth quality, like it had been worn down or polished. The undergrowth was flattened in irregular patterns that didn't match any animal trails I recognized. And there was a smell, faint but persistent, something organic and unfamiliar that I couldn't identify. I took photographs and samples, thinking maybe there was some kind of blight or insect infestation that was affecting the area. But the lab analysis came back normal. Healthy trees, normal soil composition, nothing unusual about the plant material I'd collected. 6 months later, I was reassigned to a different study area. Budget cuts, they said, and they needed my expertise somewhere else. But I heard from some of the other technicians that the wildlife populations in that section of forest never returned to normal. The sheep still avoid it, and the bears that used to den in those woods found new territory. I tried to follow up with Sarah once, about a year after the incident. I called the number from her emergency contact form and spoke to her sister. Sarah was doing fine, she said, back to her normal life in Portland, but she'd given up hiking. Wouldn't even go for walks in the city parks anymore. Just stayed indoors mostly, working from home, keeping to herself. When I asked if Sarah had ever remembered anything more about her missing days, her sister was quiet for a long moment. Then she said Sarah sometimes talked about feeling followed, even in the city. Nothing specific, just a persistent sense that something was watching her, waiting for something. But the doctor said that was normal after a traumatic experience, that the feeling would fade with time. I still think about Sarah's apologies, the way she kept saying she was sorry for bringing it back with her. At the time, I figured it was just confusion and stress talking. But sometimes, when I'm working alone in the backcountry, and I come across an area where the wildlife patterns don't make sense, where the forest feels a little too quiet, or the trees look somehow different, I remember that urgent tone in her voice. She knew something had followed her back. She couldn't explain it or even remember it clearly. But she knew, and whatever it was, it's still out there, still changing things in ways that are too subtle to document, but too consistent to ignore. I've never seen Sarah since that day at the nature center, but I think about her every time I'm working alone in the woods, especially when I get that feeling that something is watching me from just beyond the tree line. Something that doesn't belong in any of the patterns I've spent my career learning to recognize. I'm Janet Reeves, and I've been working communications for the Tongass National Forest for 16 years. Most people don't think much about what happens in the radio room, just voices crackling over static, weather reports, routine check-ins from rangers spread across thousands of square miles of wilderness. It's steady work, predictable in its way. Fire towers report in every 6 hours. Maintenance crews call when they start and finish their shifts. Search teams coordinate through me when someone goes missing. You learn to read voices over the radio. After this many years, I can tell when someone's tired, scared, or just having a bad day, even through all the static and interference these mountains throw at radio signals. I know which rangers are careful about protocol and which ones are more casual. I know who talks too much and who barely says enough to get the job done. Marcus Webb was one of the careful ones. He'd been working fire watch at Tower 12 for 3 seasons. Always professional, always on time with his reports. Tower 12 sits on a ridge about 40 miles southeast of Juneau, one of the more isolated postings in our system. The access road washes out regularly, so whoever draws that assignment usually stays up there for 2-week rotations, checking in by radio every 6 hours and monitoring for smoke or unusual activity. It was mid-August of 2019 when I took the call that still keeps me up some nights. Late shift, just me and the overnight supervisor in the communications center. Most of the forest was quiet, clear weather, low fire danger, just routine maintenance, and a few research teams working the southern sectors. Marcus was due to check in at midnight. When the radio crackled to life at 11:58, I was already reaching for the logbook to record his report. Base, this is Tower 12. Evening check-in. His voice sounded normal, maybe a little tired. Copy Tower 12. Go ahead with your report. All clear for weather and fire conditions. No smoke visible. But, he paused, and I could hear him breathing over the static. Base, I'm seeing some lights down in the valley, moving around down there. That wasn't unusual. We get hunters, sometimes researchers with night equipment, occasionally people who shouldn't be in the area but manage to get back there anyway. Copy. Tower 12. Can you identify the source? Negative. Too far to make out details, but there's definitely activity. More lights than I'd expect for a research team. I made the notation in the log. Do you want me to dispatch someone to check it out? Let me keep an eye on it tonight. If they're still there in the morning, maybe send a patrol. Copy that. Anything else to report? No, that's all. Tower 12 clear. Standard call. Nothing unusual except for the lights, which honestly wasn't that strange. People get into areas they're not supposed to be all the time. And usually, they clear out once they realize where they are. But Marcus didn't call in at 6 a.m. like he was supposed to. I tried raising him at 6:15, then again at 6:30. Nothing but static. By 7, I had to wake up the day supervisor and report a missed check-in. We have protocols for that. Tower 12 is remote enough that equipment failure isn't uncommon, and sometimes weather can interfere with transmissions even when it looks clear. At 8 a.m., I tried again. This time, Marcus answered. Sort of. The radio crackled to life with Marcus's call sign, but instead of his usual report, all I got was static. Heavy, persistent static, with something underneath it, a sound that took me a few seconds to identify. It sounded like someone crying. Tower 12. This is base. Please clarify your transmission. More static, but clearer now. Definitely someone sobbing. The sound rising and falling like someone trying to control themselves, but not quite managing it. Between the sobs, I could make out what sounded like Marcus's voice, but I couldn't understand what he was saying. The words were too distorted, too broken up by interference and emotion. I recorded the transmission and kept trying to reach him. Tower 12. If you can hear this, please confirm your status. Are you injured? Do you need assistance? The crying continued for maybe 10 minutes, sometimes fading into pure static, sometimes coming through clear enough that I could tell it was definitely Marcus. There was something desperate about it. Not just fear, but a kind of hopeless grief that made my chest tight, just listening to it. Then, around 8:15, the transmission changed. The crying stopped, but I could hear Marcus's voice more clearly, though he still wasn't responding to my calls. He was talking to someone, having what sounded like a conversation, but I could only hear his side of it. I know, he kept saying. I know you're not supposed to be here. I know that. Then silence for a few minutes, followed by more static, and what sounded like Marcus writing something down, the scratch of pencil on paper coming through the radio somehow. This went on for nearly 30 minutes. Marcus talking to someone I couldn't hear, long periods of writing, occasional returns to that heartbroken sobbing. I kept trying to reach him, kept asking for his status, but he never acknowledged my transmissions. At 8:45, the radio went completely dead. Not static, not interference, just silence on the Tower 12 frequency. By that time, I'd already contacted the supervisor, and we'd dispatched a helicopter with a medical team. The access road to Tower 12 had washed out the week before, so helicopter was the only way to get up there quickly. But weather was moving in from the coast, and they couldn't get through until the next morning. I spent the rest of my shift trying to raise Marcus on the radio, but got nothing. The silence from Tower 12 felt different from normal equipment. Failure more complete, more final. When the day shift came in, I briefed them on the situation and went home. But I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that desperate sobbing and Marcus saying over and over that someone wasn't supposed to be there. The helicopter team reached Tower 12 at first light the next morning. They found Marcus's body at the base of the tower. The preliminary assessment was that he'd fallen from the observation deck, but the circumstances were unusual enough that they called in investigators. The tower itself was undamaged, all the radio equipment functioning normally. Marcus's personal belongings were still in the cabin, his food and water supplies barely touched. No signs of struggle, no evidence of anyone else having been there recently. The investigators found tracks around the base of the tower, but they were consistent with Marcus walking around the area. Nothing to suggest other people or any kind of altercation. But there was one thing that didn't fit the simple accident theory. They found Marcus's logbook in the cabin, and the last entry took up nearly 20 pages. The same sentence, written over and over in Marcus's handwriting. They're not supposed to be here. Hundreds of times, filling page after page, the handwriting getting shakier and more erratic as it went on, but always the same words. The timestamps on the entries corresponded exactly with the period when I'd been hearing him on the radio starting around 8 a.m. and continuing until just before the transmission cut out. The official report listed Marcus's death as an accidental fall, probably caused by disorientation or a medical emergency. The repeated logbook entries were attributed to acute stress reaction, possibly triggered by isolation and sleep deprivation. The radio transmissions I'd recorded were analyzed but deemed inconclusive. Atmospheric interference can cause all kinds of strange effects, especially in mountainous terrain. I kept working communications, but I requested a transfer away from the overnight shift. I told my supervisor it was for personal reasons, and he didn't push for details. Most of the time, I can put what happened that night out of my mind. It's just another unusual incident in a job full of them. But sometimes, when I'm monitoring the radio traffic from our more remote stations, I think about Marcus's voice that night. The way he kept saying, "I know you're not supposed to be here." Like he was trying to explain something to someone, trying to apologize or make them understand. And I think about those pages and pages of the same sentence, written with increasing desperation, as if he needed to document something that couldn't be documented any other way. The lights Marcus reported seeing in the valley were never explained. No hunting permits had been issued for that area. No research teams were scheduled to be working there. The investigators checked with all the local agencies and universities, but no one claimed to have been in that section of the forest on the night Marcus died. I still work Tower 12's frequency sometimes when we're short-staffed. It's been reassigned to automated weather monitoring now. No one stations rangers up there anymore after what happened to Marcus. But the tower still sends its signals, regular as clockwork, reporting temperature and wind conditions and visibility readings. Sometimes, though, just for a second or two, I think I hear something else mixed in with the weather data. A sound like someone crying, or a voice trying to say something important through all the static and interference. But when I check the recordings later, there's never anything there except the mechanical voice reading off numbers and measurements. I tell myself it's just atmospheric interference, just my imagination filling in sounds that aren't really there. But I keep Marcus's voice recordings from that night in my desk drawer, and sometimes I listen to them again, trying to understand what he was responding to, what made him write those words so many times that his hand must have cramped and his mind must have broken a little more with each repetition. They're not supposed to be here. I wonder if he ever figured out who they were, or where they were supposed to be instead. I wonder if that's what killed him. Not the fall, but finally understanding something that was too big or too wrong for one person to carry alone. I'm Paul Hendricks, and I've been working these mountains for 22 years. Started as seasonal help right out of college. worked my way up to senior ranger for the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest. In all that time, I've seen plenty of things that don't make sense at first. People do strange things when they're lost, scared, or pushed beyond their limits. But what I found in October of 2016 still bothers me in ways I can't quite explain. I was doing routine patrol of the backcountry trails in the North Cascades, checking campsites and making sure the late-season hikers were prepared for weather that can turn dangerous without warning. It was a Tuesday morning, clear and cold, the kind of day that makes you grateful to work outdoors, even when you're hiking alone through country that most people will never see. I was about 6 miles up the Cascade River Trail when I heard a sound that didn't belong in the forest. Not the usual sounds of wildlife or wind through the trees, but something rhythmic and mechanical. Footsteps, but too regular, too precise, like someone marching in place. I followed the sound off the main trail, pushing through thick stands of Douglas fir and hemlock until I reached a small clearing maybe 30 yards across. That's where I saw him. A man in hiking gear, walking in a perfect circle around the perimeter of the clearing. He was carrying a full backpack, wearing proper boots, moving at a steady pace like he was on a regular day hike. But he wasn't stopping, wasn't looking around, wasn't doing anything except walking that circle over and over again. I called out to him, "Hey there, you okay?" He didn't respond, didn't even look in my direction, just kept walking, one foot in front of the other, following an invisible path around the edge of the clearing. His stride was exactly the same each time I counted his steps, and it was always 47 steps to complete the circle. Then he'd start again. I moved closer, trying to get his attention. "Sir, I'm Ranger Hendricks with the Forest Service. Can you hear me?" Still nothing. He passed within 10 feet of me, and I got a good look at his face. Middle-aged man, maybe 50, with several weeks' worth of beard growth. His eyes were open, focused straight ahead, but they had a vacant quality, like he was looking at something far away. His clothes were dirty and worn, but not torn. His pack looked properly fitted and maintained. What struck me most was how mechanical his movement was. No variation in pace, no adjustment for the uneven ground, no natural sway or shift in posture. Just that same steady rhythm, step after step, circle after circle. I tried walking alongside him, talking to him, even stepping directly in his path. He would stop if I blocked his way, but only for a moment, shifting slightly to go around me before resuming his exact route. He never made eye contact, never acknowledged my presence in any way. After watching him for about 20 minutes, I radioed for backup and medical assistance. This was clearly someone in crisis, though I couldn't tell if it was medical, psychological, or something else entirely. The way he moved, the complete lack of response to external stimuli, it reminded me of cases I'd heard about involving severe hypothermia or stroke, where people can function physically but lose higher cognitive abilities. While I waited for the medical team, I tried to figure out who this man was and how he'd gotten here. The clearing was well off any established trail, in an area where you'd need good navigation skills and experience to find your way. His gear looked expensive and well-maintained, suggesting he was an experienced hiker. But experienced hikers don't usually end up walking in circles in remote clearings. I checked my radio for any missing person reports that might match his description. Found one that made my chest tighten. Robert Chen, age 52, from Seattle, reported missing 3 weeks earlier when he failed to return from a solo hike on the Mountain Loop Highway, about 20 miles southeast of where I was standing. The description matched perfectly: height, build, even the blue jacket and gray backpack. But 20 miles through some of the roughest terrain in the North Cascades, and he'd been missing for 3 weeks. If this was Robert Chen, how had he survived that long? And what had happened to put him in this condition? The medical team arrived by helicopter about 2 hours later, along with a search and rescue coordinator and a paramedic trained in wilderness medicine. By that time, Robert, because I was certain now that's who it was, had walked his circle probably 200 times without stopping, without resting, without showing any signs of fatigue. The paramedic tried the same approaches I had, calling his name, trying to establish eye contact, attempting to break his pattern by blocking his path. Robert's response was always the same: brief pause, slight adjustment to continue his route, then back to the exact same pace and pattern. His vital signs were stable but concerning: blood pressure low, heart rate elevated but steady, signs of dehydration and malnutrition. The paramedic estimated he'd lost 20 or 30 pounds since his disappearance. But physically, he was still functioning, still moving, still carrying that 40-pound pack like it weighed nothing. We tried everything we could think of to reach him, played recordings of his wife's voice that his family had provided, showed him photos from his wallet, even tried playing music from his phone, thinking familiar sounds might break through whatever was keeping him locked in this repetitive behavior. Nothing worked. The decision was made to sedate him for transport to the hospital. Even that was unsettling. As the sedative took effect, he didn't collapse or show signs of drowsiness like you'd expect. He just gradually slowed down, his steps getting longer and more labored, until finally he stopped mid-stride and toppled forward like a machine that had been switched off. At the hospital, the doctors ran every test they could think of: brain scans, blood work, neurological assessments. Robert was severely malnourished and dehydrated, but there was no obvious medical explanation for his behavior. No signs of stroke, no evidence of drug use, no brain injury that would account for the repetitive walking pattern. The psychiatrist who evaluated him found signs of what she called catatonic behavior, but couldn't identify what might have triggered it. Robert remained unresponsive to all attempts at communication. He would eat if food was placed in his mouth, would drink if water was given to him, but showed no initiative or awareness of his surroundings. The only change was that he kept trying to get out of bed and walk. The nurses had to restrain him because he would stand up and start making the same circular motions, even in the confined space of the hospital room. 47 steps, trying to turn in a circle over and over again. Robert Chen died 2 days later. Heart failure, the doctors said, brought on by prolonged malnutrition and the stress of whatever had happened to him during those 3 weeks in the wilderness. His wife was with him at the end, but he never acknowledged her presence, never showed any sign that he recognized where he was or what was happening to him. The official report listed his death as the result of exposure and exhaustion following an extended period lost in the wilderness. The repetitive behavior was attributed to a psychological break triggered by extreme stress and isolation. Case closed. But I've been back to that clearing several times since then, trying to understand what I saw that day. It's not easy to find. You have to know exactly where you're going and be willing to push through some difficult terrain. There's nothing special about it, nothing that would draw someone's attention or make them want to stay there, except for the path. If you know what to look for, you can still see it. A faint depression in the forest floor, worn down by repeated footsteps, forming a perfect circle around the perimeter of the clearing. 47 steps, just like I counted that day. The vegetation is different there, trampled down and slow to regrow. I measured the circle once, out of professional curiosity, exactly 38 feet in diameter. I couldn't find any significance to that number. No natural feature or landmark that would explain why someone would choose that specific route. But the path is there, worn into the ground by weeks of constant walking. Sometimes I wonder what Robert Chen saw during those 3 weeks. What kept him walking that same circle day and night without rest? The medical examiner estimated he'd lost about 30 pounds, which suggests he was consuming about 300 calories a day, just enough to keep his body functioning, but not enough to maintain normal weight. Like something was rationing his energy, keeping him alive, but not letting him stop. I think about his family, how they had to watch him waste away in that hospital bed, still trying to walk his invisible circle, even when he could barely stand. I think about the search teams that looked for him in all the wrong places, never thinking to check 20 miles away from where he'd started. But mostly, I think about the look in his eyes that day in the clearing. Not fear, not confusion, Not even exhaustion. Just a kind of empty focus, like he was concentrating very hard on something only he could see. Something that required his complete attention, his total commitment, even if it killed him. I still patrol that area regularly. It's part of my assigned territory, and I take my responsibilities seriously. But I always make sure to check that clearing, to verify that the path is still empty, that no one else has taken up Robert Chen's endless walk. Because sometimes, when the light hits the trees just right, and the forest is very quiet, I can almost see him there, still walking, still carrying his pack, still counting out those 47 steps over and over again, still focused on something the rest of us can't see, something that was important enough to walk himself to death, rather than break away from it. I'm Lisa Chen, and I've been doing maintenance work for the Olympic National Forest for 11 years. Most people don't think much about what happens to the remote research stations and cabins scattered throughout the wilderness areas. Someone has to check on them, repair weather damage, make sure they're ready for the next research team or emergency use. It's quiet work. Just me and a truck full of tools, spending days in places where you might not see another person for weeks. In March of 2020, I was assigned to clean and assess Cabin 7, about 15 miles up the Ho River Trail. It's one of our more isolated research stations, used mostly by wildlife biologists and occasionally by search and rescue teams as a staging area. The last group to use it had been a university team studying Roosevelt elk migration patterns, but they'd evacuated early in February when a winter storm system moved through the area faster than predicted. The drive up the access road took most of the morning. Spring snowmelt had washed out a section near mile marker 8, so I had to park the truck and hike the last 3 miles with my gear. The cabin sits in a grove of old-growth cedars, positioned to overlook a small meadow, where researchers can observe wildlife without disturbing their natural patterns. From the outside, everything looked normal. The cabin's metal roof had held up well through the winter, and the propane tanks were properly secured. No obvious damage from falling branches or weather. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, expecting the usual post-occupancy cleanup research notes left behind. Equipment that needed to be inventoried. General tidying up. The main room was cleaner than I expected. Research stations usually show signs of recent habitation, coffee cups in the sink, papers scattered on the work table, personal items forgotten in the rush to evacuate, but Cabin 7 looked almost unused. The bunks were made with military precision. The work surfaces were clear, and everything was organized in a way that seemed deliberate, purposeful. I started with the standard inventory checklist: emergency supplies, communication equipment, propane levels, structural integrity. Everything checked out fine, but as I worked, I began to notice small details that didn't quite fit the story I'd been told about the evacuation. The research team's official report said they'd left in a hurry due to deteriorating weather conditions, but their gear was packed and stored with care, not thrown together hastily. Food supplies were organized and sealed properly, not abandoned mid-meal. The generator had been shut down according to protocol, with all the switches in the correct positions. It was when I was checking the equipment storage closet that I found the camera. It was sitting on a shelf by itself, a standard digital camera that researchers use for documenting their work. Not unusual, teams sometimes leave equipment behind accidentally, especially during emergency evacuations. I picked it up to add it to the lost property log, and noticed it was still turned on, battery nearly dead but functioning. I connected it to the laptop I use for inventory reports, planning to download any research photos and add them to the team's data files. What I found made me sit down hard in the desk chair and stare at the screen for a long time. The camera contained 643 photographs, all taken between February 20th and February 23rd. The research team had evacuated on February 18th. Every single photograph was of the same view, the trail that leads from the cabin down toward the meadow. Taken from the front porch, the same angle, the same framing, just slight variations in lighting as the hours and days passed. Photo after photo after photo, taken every 4 to 6 minutes for 3.5 days straight. I clicked through them methodically, looking for some explanation. Maybe the camera had malfunctioned, gotten stuck on some kind of automatic timer setting. But the timestamps were too irregular for that, and the small variations in angle suggested someone had been manually triggering the shutter each time. The photos showed nothing but an empty trail winding through the forest. No wildlife, no people, no unusual activity. Just the same stretch of dirt path disappearing into the trees, photographed obsessively from dawn to dusk and back to dawn again. But as I scrolled through them, I started to notice patterns that made my chest feel tight. The photos weren't random. Someone had been documenting specific times, every time a cloud passed over the sun, every time the light changed significantly, every time the shadows shifted position. It was methodical, purposeful, like someone conducting an experiment or keeping watch for something. I checked the metadata more carefully. The photos had been taken with manual settings, proper exposure, and focus for each shot. This wasn't accidental or the result of equipment malfunction. Someone had spent 3.5 days taking careful, deliberate photographs of an empty trail, never leaving the porch, never varying the composition, just documenting the passage of time and changes in light. The last photo was taken at 11:47 p.m. on February 23rd. After that, nothing. I printed out a selection of the photos and spread them on the work table, trying to understand what I was looking at. The trail in the images was the same one I'd hiked that morning to reach the cabin, a well-maintained path that researchers use to access their observation points in the meadow. Nothing threatening about it, nothing unusual. But someone had felt compelled to photograph it nearly 700 times over 4 days, alone in a remote cabin after the official research team had already evacuated. I checked the cabin's logbook, looking for any record of who might have remained behind or returned after the evacuation. Nothing. The last entry was from Dr. Sarah Martinez, the team leader, dated February 18th. Weather deteriorating rapidly. Evacuating per Forest Service recommendations. Cabin secured. All personnel accounted for. I radioed the district office to report what I'd found. Spoke with my supervisor, Tom Rodriguez, who'd been the one to coordinate the original evacuation. He confirmed that all 4 team members had been accounted for when they left Dr. Martinez, 2 graduate students and a research assistant. No one had authorization to return to the cabin, and no other permits had been issued for that area during the time period when the photos were taken. Tom asked me to complete my inspection and bring the camera back to the office for further review. I spent another 2 hours going through the cabin systematically, looking for any other signs of unauthorized occupancy. Found nothing. No extra food consumed, no additional bedding used, no personal items left behind. Whoever had taken those photos had done so without leaving any other trace of their presence. The official investigation concluded that someone had probably hiked in without proper permits, possibly a photographer or artist interested in documenting the winter landscape. The repetitive nature of the photos was attributed to artistic vision, or possibly mental health issues related to isolation. Case filed and closed. But I kept thinking about those images, the mechanical precision of the timing, the way someone had spent days focused on that single view. I went back to Cabin 7 twice more that spring, both times for legitimate maintenance work, both times hoping I might understand what I'd found there. The trail looks the same as it always has, just a path through the woods, leading down to a meadow where elk come to graze. But I found myself taking my own photos of it, trying to see what had captured someone's attention so completely that they'd spent 4 days documenting every subtle change in light and shadow. I never figured it out. The trail is just a trail. The meadow is just a meadow. Nothing special about the view from the cabin's porch. Nothing that would justify such obsessive documentation. But someone had stood in that exact spot for 3.5 days, watching and waiting and photographing, as if they expected something significant to happen. The thing that bothers me most is the timing. Every 4 to 6 minutes, day and night, for 91 hours straight. That's not random behavior. or artistic expression. That's someone maintaining a vigil, keeping watch, documenting evidence of something they believed was important. I still maintain Cabin 7 as part of my regular rotation. Research teams use it occasionally, and it's a backup shelter for anyone caught by weather in that section of the forest. But I always check that front porch carefully when I arrive, looking for signs that someone has been standing there, watching the trail, waiting for something that only they can see. Sometimes, when I'm working alone in the cabin and the light starts to change in the late afternoon, I find myself glancing out at that trail more often than I should. Not because I expect to see anything, it's just an empty path through the woods, like it's always been, but because I wonder what someone else saw there, what kept them watching and waiting and documenting the same view for days without rest. 643 photographs of nothing at all, but to someone, they must have documented everything. I'm Mark Sullivan, and I've been coordinating search and rescue operations in the Sierra Nevada for 18 years. You learn to read the mountains differently when your job is finding people who don't want to be found, or who can't find their way back on their own. Snow conditions, weather patterns, human behavior under stress, all of it becomes part of a larger picture. You're constantly assembling and reassembling as situations develop. In April of 2017, we were dealing with the aftermath of an unusually heavy winter. The snowpack was deeper than it had been in decades, and as the spring melt accelerated, we were seeing increased avalanche activity throughout the backcountry areas. My team was doing routine assessments of known slide zones, documenting damage and identifying potential hazards for the coming hiking season. We were working the north face of Mount Whitney, in an area that had experienced multiple avalanches during the winter. The largest had come down in late February, a massive slide that had stripped trees and scoured the mountainside down to bare rock in some places. It was exactly the kind of natural disaster that reshapes the landscape and creates new hazards we need to map and understand. I was leading a 4-person team, 2 experienced mountaineers from our volunteer corps, a Forest Service specialist, and myself. We were about 3 miles up from the Whitney portal, working our way through the debris field left by the February avalanche. Broken trees, displaced boulders, everything you'd expect to find after tons of snow had come thundering down the mountain at highway speeds. It was my partner, Jenny Martinez, who spotted it first. She called out from about 50 yards up the slope, where she was photographing the upper extent of the slide zone. "Mark, you need to see this." I climbed up to where she was standing and followed her gaze down into a depression that had been carved out by the avalanche. At first, I thought she was showing me a root cellar, or maybe an old mining cache, some kind of artificial structure that had been exposed when the snow stripped away decades of accumulated debris. But as we got closer, it became clear that what we were looking at was much more recent. Someone had built a winter shelter in that depression, using branches and tarps and whatever materials they could scavenge from the forest. It was partially collapsed now, but the construction was ingenious, positioned to take advantage of natural windbreaks, insulated with pine boughs, designed to shed snow rather than support its weight. The shelter was empty, but it showed clear signs of extended occupation. A sleeping area lined with more pine boughs, a fire pit with charcoal residue, even a small cache of food supplies that had somehow survived both the winter and the avalanche. Everything was organized and purposeful, not the desperate improvisation you'd expect from someone caught in an emergency situation. What really caught our attention was the notebook. It was wrapped in plastic, tucked into a crevice in the rock wall, where it had stayed dry despite everything that had happened. A standard composition book, the kind students use in school, filled with handwriting in blue ink. The cover was labeled Winter Journal, December 2016, March 2017, in neat block letters. I opened it carefully, expecting to find the survival record of someone who'd gotten stranded during the heavy snows. Maybe a hiker who'd been caught by early winter storms, someone who'd had to improvise shelter and wait for spring. We get cases like that occasionally, though usually they don't end well. The first entries were exactly what I expected. December 15th. Snow coming down harder than forecast. Decided to wait it out rather than try to get back to the trailhead in whiteout conditions. December 17th. Still snowing. Good thing I brought extra food. Shelter holding up well. Standard survival documentation. The kind of sensible record keeping that increases your chances of making it through a difficult situation. But as I read further, the tone began to change in ways that made me uncomfortable. December 23rd. Heard voices outside the shelter last night. Called out, but got no answer. Tracks in the snow this morning, but they don't look right. Too deep for the amount of snow that fell, and they stop about 10 feet from the shelter, like whoever was walking just disappeared. December 30th. They came back again. I can hear them moving around outside, but when I look out, there's nothing there. The tracks are different each time, sometimes boot prints, sometimes bare feet, even though it's below freezing. Found a circle of stones arranged around my fire pit this morning. I didn't put them there. I exchanged glances with Jenny, who was reading over my shoulder. We'd both seen enough genuine survival situations to know when someone was dealing with isolation-induced hallucinations or hypothermia-related confusion. But the handwriting remained steady and clear, and the practical details of daily survival continued to be accurate and well documented. January 8th. Built a better door for the shelter entrance. Whatever is visiting me at night, I don't want it getting inside while I'm sleeping. The stones around the fire pit have been rearranged again, always in different pattern. Sometimes I find small objects left behind, pieces of bark, arranged in spirals. Smooth river stones that don't belong on this mountainside. January 15th. I think they're trying to communicate. The patterns are becoming more complex, more deliberate. Last night I left out some of my food, and by morning it was gone. But in its place was a bundle of pine needles woven together in a way I've never seen before. No tracks leading to or from the spot where I left the food. The entries continued through February, becoming more detailed about these nightly visits, more analytical about the patterns and behaviors being documented. Whoever was writing showed no signs of psychological deterioration, no increasing paranoia or irrationality. If anything, the tone became more scientific, more curious about what was happening. February 19th. The avalanche came down yesterday, exactly as I predicted, based on the wind and temperature patterns. The shelter held, though part of the east wall collapsed. I was sure I would be killed, but when I dug out this morning, I found my entire camp had been reinforced with additional branches and stones. Work that must have been done during the slide itself. No human could have been moving around outside during an avalanche. February 25th. I understand now why I never see them, why their tracks disappear so abruptly. They exist in the spaces between what we think of as real. The avalanche didn't bury me because they moved it around me, channeled it away from the shelter. I owe them my life, but I don't think they see it that way. To them, I'm just another part of the mountain now. The final entry was dated March 3rd, written in the same steady handwriting, but containing only one line. I understand now why they never leave footprints. After that, nothing. No explanation. No indication of what had happened to the person who'd been documenting these experiences for nearly 3 months. We searched the area thoroughly, looking for any sign of whoever had built the shelter and written the journal. Found nothing. No personal belongings beyond what was in the shelter itself. No identification. No indication of how they'd reached that remote location or how they'd left it. The food supplies suggested someone who'd been prepared for a long stay, but there was no way to tell if they'd left voluntarily or met some other fate. The avalanche debris told us the shelter had been buried under 15 feet of snow for at least 6 weeks before the spring melt exposed it. During that time, temperatures had remained well below freezing, making survival in a buried shelter virtually impossible without outside assistance. We filed a report with the appropriate agencies, but without any missing person reports that matched the time frame and location, there wasn't much to investigate. The journal entries were noted as evidence of someone's extended stay in the wilderness, possibly someone dealing with mental health issues related to isolation and extreme conditions. But I kept thinking about those entries, the careful documentation of impossible things, the steady progression from confusion to understanding to acceptance. I've read enough survival accounts to recognize the real thing. And despite the strange content, that journal had the ring of authentic experience. 6 months later, I was back in the same area for routine trail maintenance. The shelter site had been cleaned up, the debris removed, but you could still see where it had been. What I noticed this time were the stone arrangements scattered throughout the avalanche zone. Circles and spirals and patterns that looked deliberate, purposeful, like markers or messages left by someone who wanted to communicate, but didn't use written language. I've been back to that site several times since then, always as part of legitimate work in the area, but also because I can't shake the feeling that whoever wrote that journal might have been documenting something real, something that exists in the spaces between what we think of as normal and what actually happens in places where humans rarely go. The stone patterns change every time I visit. New arrangements appear. Old ones are modified or moved to different locations. It could be natural processes, freeze-thaw cycles, animal activity, erosion, but the patterns are too complex, too purposeful for random natural forces. I still coordinate search and rescue operations throughout the Sierra Nevada, and I still read every report, every piece of documentation that comes through our office. But since finding that journal, I pay closer attention to the details that don't quite fit. The small inconsistencies that might indicate something more than simple human error or environmental factors. Because sometimes, when I'm working alone in the backcountry, and I come across arrangements of stones or branches that seem too deliberate to be accidental, I think about that final journal entry, about someone who spent 3 months learning to see the mountain differently, who came to understand that not everything that lives there leaves footprints in the snow. And I wonder if they're still out there somewhere, still learning, still documenting experiences that the rest of us aren't equipped to understand, still finding ways to survive in the spaces between what we think is possible and what actually exists in places where the maps run out and the familiar rules stop applying. I'm Karen Oakes, and I've been working fire prevention for the Denali National Park System for 13 years. Most people think my job is just about putting out campfires and checking permits. But fire behavior in the Alaska wilderness is more complex than that. You learn to read burn patterns, understand fuel loads, predict how fires will behave under different weather conditions. When something doesn't follow the normal rules, you notice. In September of 2019, I started getting reports about a campfire in the backcountry that wouldn't go out. It was located about 8 miles up the Savage River Trail, in a dispersed camping area that sees moderate use during the hiking season. The first report came from a family from Colorado who'd been hiking through the area on a 3-day trip. They said they'd smelled smoke from about a mile away, which isn't unusual. Campfires carry on the wind, especially in the early morning when the air is still. But when they reached the site, they found a fire burning in what appeared to be an abandoned campsite. No tent, no gear, no signs of recent human activity except for the fire itself. The family had done the right thing, checked the area for any campers who might need assistance, made sure the fire was contained within a proper ring, then reported it when they got back to the ranger station. Standard protocol for an unattended fire, which can be a serious safety hazard in dry conditions. I hiked up to check it out the next morning. The Colorado family's description was accurate, a campfire burning steadily in a well-constructed stone ring, but no other evidence of recent camping. The fire had burned down to a bed of coals, but it was still producing heat and occasional flames when the wind caught it right. What struck me immediately was how clean the burn was. The wood was consumed completely, leaving only fine ash and glowing embers. No partially burned logs, no uneven burning patterns, nothing to suggest the fire had been hastily abandoned or inadequately tended. It looked like someone had carefully maintained it and then simply walked away, I followed standard procedure, made sure the fire was completely extinguished, soaked the ashes thoroughly, stirred the remains to check for any remaining heat. The whole process took about 20 minutes, and when I was finished, the site was cold and safe. I hiked back down, filed my report, and figured that was the end of it. 3 days later, I got another call about the same location. A solo hiker reported seeing smoke coming from the exact same spot. Same description, campfire burning in a stone ring. No signs of current occupation. Well maintained, but apparently abandoned. I hiked back up, and sure enough, there was a fire burning in the same ring I'd extinguished 3 days earlier. Not just rekindled embers, a full campfire with fresh wood, burning hot and clean. The stone ring was exactly as I'd left it, but someone had obviously rebuilt the fire and added new fuel. This time, I looked around more carefully for signs of who might be maintaining it. Found no footprints in the soft ground around the site, no evidence of anyone having brought wood or camping gear to the area. The wood itself appeared to be deadfall collected locally, which made sense, but there was no trail of disturbed vegetation or other signs that someone had been gathering fuel. I extinguished the fire again, this time being even more thorough. Soaked everything, scattered the ashes, even removed some of the stones from the ring to discourage anyone from rebuilding it in the same spot. Documented everything with photographs and detailed notes from my report. A week later, another report. This time from a couple who'd been camping about a quarter-mile downstream. They'd been awakened during the night by the smell of wood smoke and had hiked over to investigate in the morning. Found the same thing, campfire burning steadily in the reconstructed stone ring. No other signs of human presence. I was starting to feel like I was in some kind of loop. Hiked back up the trail for the third time. Found the fire burning exactly as described. The stone ring had been rebuilt precisely the way it had been originally, using the same rocks I'd scattered. Someone was clearly going to considerable effort to maintain this fire, but I couldn't figure out who or why. This time, I decided to stake out the area. Set up an observation post about 200 yards uphill, where I could watch the site without being seen. Brought camping gear and settled in for what I figured would be a boring but necessary surveillance operation. I watched that fire burn for 6 hours straight. Never saw a single person approach the site. Never saw anyone add fuel or tend the flames. But the fire kept burning at the same steady rate. Never flaring up, never dying down, just maintaining a consistent level of heat and flame that shouldn't have been possible without regular attention. When darkness fell, I moved closer and spent the night watching from about 50 yards away. The fire continued burning through the night, providing just enough light to see the immediate area around the ring. No one came to tend it. No one added wood. But it never went out. By morning, I was convinced someone was playing an elaborate prank, though I couldn't figure out how they were managing it. I approached the fire, expecting to find some kind of artificial fuel source or hidden mechanism. Instead, I found a normal campfire, burning normal wood, producing normal heat and smoke and ash. I extinguished it again, more aggressively this time. Used a full 5 gallons of water, stirred the ashes until they were mud, scattered everything across a wide area, took another set of photographs and hiked back down, feeling frustrated and confused by the whole situation. The reports kept coming. Every few days, someone would call in about smoke from that same location. Each time, I'd hike up and find the fire burning exactly as before. Each time, I'd extinguish it completely. Each time, it would be burning again within a week. After a month of this, I brought in a colleague to witness what was happening. Rick Martinez, another fire prevention specialist with 15 years of experience. We hiked up together, found the fire burning as usual, and Rick confirmed that there was nothing normal about the situation. Rick had theories: underground coal seam, gas leak, some kind of chemical reaction that was producing continuous combustion. We took soil samples, checked for unusual mineral deposits, even brought in equipment to test for gas emissions. Everything came back normal. Just regular forest soil, regular deadwood, regular fire, but the fire kept burning. In October, we got our first significant rainfall of the season. 3 days of steady rain, heavy enough to extinguish any normal campfire. I hiked up during the storm, expecting to finally find the site cold and safe. Instead, I found the fire burning as steadily as ever, apparently unaffected by the water falling directly on it. That's when I knew we were dealing with something beyond normal fire behavior. Rain that heavy should have put out any conventional fire, no matter how well established. But this one just kept burning, the flames dancing in the rainfall, like they were being sustained by something other than ordinary combustion. I decided to try a different approach. Instead of just extinguishing the fire, I dismantled the entire site, broke apart the stone ring, removed all the stones, scattered them across a wide area, removed all the burned material, all the ash, even scraped away the top layer of soil, left nothing that could support combustion. A week later, the fire was burning again in a perfectly reconstructed stone ring, using the exact same stones I'd scattered, positioned exactly as they had been originally. That's when I called in the state fire marshal's office. This was beyond anything I dealt with in 13 years of fire prevention work, and I needed someone with more resources and experience to help figure out what was happening. Fire Marshal Jim Powell arrived the next week with a full investigation team. They documented everything, took extensive photographs, collected samples, interviewed all the hikers who'd reported the fire. Their conclusion was that someone was deliberately maintaining the fire for unknown reasons, probably someone with extensive wilderness skills and intimate knowledge of the area. But they couldn't explain how someone was doing it without leaving any traces, or why anyone would go to such elaborate efforts for over a month. The investigation was officially closed as an ongoing case of unauthorized fire maintenance, with instructions to continue monitoring the situation. I kept hiking up to check on the fire, now more out of curiosity than professional duty. It burned through October, November, even into December when snow began to accumulate in the area. Snow that should have smothered any normal fire just seemed to melt away from the immediate area around the ring, leaving a small circle of bare ground where the flames continued to dance. It was in mid-December when I finally managed to put it out for good. I'd brought a specialized fire suppressant, the kind we use for chemical fires that don't respond to water, applied it systematically to every inch of the site, then covered everything with sand and gravel to prevent any possible rekindling. This time, it worked. The fire went out and stayed out. But when I was sifting through the final ashes, I found something that made my chest tight with confusion and unease. A gold wedding ring, tarnished but intact, buried deep in the ash bed where it must have been sitting for the entire time the fire had been burning. I took the ring to the state police, thinking it might be evidence from a missing person case. They ran it through their databases and found a match that made no sense at all. The ring had been reported as personal property of a woman named Elizabeth Morrison, who'd been reported missing from her home in Phoenix, Arizona, on September 15, 2019, the same day I'd first extinguished the fire. But according to the missing person report, Elizabeth Morrison had never been to Alaska. Her family insisted she'd disappeared from her apartment in Phoenix, leaving behind her car, her purse, her phone, everything except the clothes she was wearing, and her wedding ring. The Arizona police had no explanation for how her ring had ended up in a campfire in the Alaska wilderness, over 2,000 miles from where she'd disappeared. The case was filed as an unexplained connection, but no further investigation was warranted based on the evidence. I still patrol that section of the Savage River Trail regularly. The fire site remains cold, just a circle of scorched earth and scattered stones where nothing grows quite right. But sometimes, especially on clear nights when the wind is still, I think I can smell wood smoke drifting down from that direction. And I think about Elizabeth Morrison, whose ring spent 3 months burning in a fire that couldn't be extinguished, in a place she'd never been, for reasons no one can explain. I wonder what connection she had to that remote spot in the Alaska wilderness. What brought her ring there? What kept that fire burning long after any normal fuel should have been consumed. I wonder if she's still out there somewhere, in the spaces between what we can document and what actually happens in places where the familiar rules don't seem to apply. I'm Tom Larson, and I've been conducting wildlife research in the Cascade Range for 19 years. Most of my work involves tracking animal populations and migration patterns using remote cameras positioned throughout the backcountry. You learn to read the forest through thousands of hours of footage: what's normal, what's unusual, what deserves closer attention. When something appears in the data that doesn't belong, you notice. In October of 2021, I was analyzing footage from a camera array I'd established to monitor elk movement along the North Fork of the Teanaway River. I had 12 cameras positioned at strategic points along known game trails, programmed to capture images triggered by motion and heat signatures. Standard research setup, the kind of long-term data collection that helps us understand how wildlife adapts to changing environmental conditions. I was processing the previous month's footage when I noticed an anomaly in the data from Camera 7. It was positioned about 6 miles up the valley, mounted on a large Douglas fir, overlooking a game trail that elk use to access a mineral lick. The camera had been functioning normally, capturing the expected wildlife activity: elk, deer, an occasional black bear, the usual variety of smaller animals. But starting on October 3rd, the camera began recording something else. Every night at exactly 3:17 a.m., the motion sensor was triggered by a human figure walking past the camera. Always the same time, always the same direction, heading deeper into the valley, away from any established trails or camping areas. The figure appeared to be carrying something, a small bundle held close to the chest, and moved with the steady, purposeful gait of someone who knew exactly where they were going. At first, I assumed it was a poacher, or maybe someone camping illegally in the backcountry. The timing was unusual. Most people don't hike alone at 3 in the morning, but it wasn't unheard of. Some hunters prefer to move in darkness to avoid detection, and the area does see occasional unauthorized camping, despite being designated wilderness. But as I reviewed more footage, the pattern became increasingly disturbing. Night after night, the same figure, the same time, the same direction. No variation in pace or posture. No signs of fatigue or hesitation. Just that steady, mechanical walk past the camera, carrying the small bundle, disappearing into the darkness beyond the infrared range. What really caught my attention was how consistent the timing was. Not approximately 3:17, but exactly 3:17. Down to the minute. I've analyzed thousands of hours of wildlife footage, and natural behavior doesn't follow that kind of precision. Animals have patterns, but they're influenced by weather, food availability, seasonal changes. This looked more like clockwork than biology. I decided to check the other cameras in the array to see if I could track the figure's route through the valley. Found similar footage on cameras 4 and 9, the same figure, always heading in the same direction, always at times that would put them passing camera 7 at exactly 3:17. Whoever this was, they were following a specific route through some of the most remote terrain in the Cascades. The quality of the infrared footage made it difficult to see details, but I could make out enough to know I was looking at a middle-aged man, medium build, wearing what appeared to be standard hiking gear. The bundle he carried looked small enough to be a sleeping bag or personal belongings, though the way he held it suggested something more precious or fragile. After 2 weeks of identical footage, the nightly appearances stopped as abruptly as they'd started. October 17th was the last night the cameras recorded the figure. After that, just normal wildlife activity. I might have filed it as an interesting but ultimately unremarkable case of unauthorized backcountry access, except for one detail that made me dig deeper into the footage. Something about the figure's posture and gait looked familiar, like I'd seen this person before in a different context. I enhanced the clearest images using software we normally reserve for identifying individual animals from camera trap data. The resolution wasn't great, but it was good enough to see facial features and distinctive aspects of clothing and equipment. What I saw made me pull out my files from the previous year's missing person cases. In August of 2020, a solo camper named Robert Hayes had disappeared while hiking in the same general area. 53 years old, experienced outdoorsman from Spokane, last seen at the Salmon Lasac campground before heading out for a 5-day backcountry trip. His family had reported him missing when he failed to return, and search teams had spent 2 weeks combing the area where I'd been recording the nightly appearances. They never found him. The search was called off after Robert's body was discovered by other hikers about 12 miles downstream, apparently the victim of a fall from a cliff face. The medical examiner ruled it an accidental death, consistent with someone losing their footing on loose rock. Robert's family held a memorial service in September of 2020, and according to the records I could access, he'd been cremated at their request. But when I compared the enhanced camera footage to the missing person photos, I was looking at the same person. Same height and build, same distinctive hiking jacket, even the same style of backpack Robert had been carrying when he disappeared. The facial features were consistent with what I could make out from the infrared images. I reported my findings to the county sheriff's office, thinking there might be some mistake in the identification or timing of the body recovery. Maybe Robert Hayes was still alive. Maybe the body they'd found belonged to someone else. But when they checked their records, everything was clear and documented. Robert Hayes had died in August of 2020, been positively identified by his family, and cremated according to their wishes. The deputy who took my report was professional but skeptical. Camera equipment can malfunction, he pointed out, and infrared footage isn't reliable for positive identification. Date stamps can be corrupted. Images can be distorted by weather or equipment problems. All valid points, and ones I'd considered myself. But I'd been working with trail cameras for nearly 2 decades, and I knew the difference between equipment malfunction and clear documentation of human activity. The footage showed someone walking through that valley every night for 2 weeks, carrying something important enough to risk repeated solo hikes through dangerous terrain in complete darkness. I went back to the camera locations to see if I could find any physical evidence of the nightly passages. Found footprints along the game trail, clear impressions in soft soil that matched the timing and direction of the camera footage. Boot treads that were consistent with the hiking footwear visible in the infrared images. The footprints led deeper into the valley, following an old mining road that had been abandoned for decades. I followed them for about 3 miles before they disappeared at a creek crossing where the rocky ground wouldn't hold impressions. But the trail continued on the other side, suggesting whoever had been making these nightly walks had a specific destination in mind. I never found out where those footprints were leading. The terrain becomes increasingly difficult past the creek crossing, and without proper mountaineering equipment, it's not safe to attempt solo. But I did find something else that made me reconsider everything I thought I understood about what I documented. At the creek crossing, wedged between 2 rocks in the stream bed, I found a small piece of fabric, red fleece, the kind used in outdoor clothing, torn as if it had been caught on something sharp. When I compared it to the missing person file photos, it was a perfect match for the jacket Robert Hayes had been wearing when he disappeared. The county sheriff's office took the fabric as evidence, but there wasn't much they could do with it. Robert Hayes was officially deceased. His case was closed, and finding a piece of his clothing in an area where he'd been known to hike wasn't evidence of anything unusual. The fabric could have been there for over a year, deposited during his final hike, or left behind during the search operation. I kept monitoring the camera array through the fall and winter, but the nightly appearances never resumed. Just the usual wildlife activity, seasonal migration patterns, the normal rhythm of forest life that I'd been documenting for almost 20 years. But I think about those 2 weeks of footage more often than I should. About someone walking the same route every night at the same time, carrying something small and precious through some of the most remote wilderness in Washington state. About footprints that led deeper into the mountains than any casual hiker would venture. following paths that existed long before the modern trail system. I think about Robert Hayes, who died in August but was still walking through my camera range in October, still carrying that small bundle, still following some route that was important enough to repeat night after night. I think about what might have been in that bundle. What could be precious enough to justify those dangerous solo hikes through darkness? The official records are clear. Robert Hayes died in an accidental fall, was identified by his family, and was cremated according to their wishes. But the camera footage is equally clear. Someone who looked exactly like Robert Hayes spent 2 weeks walking past my equipment, following a route that led deeper into the wilderness than most people ever go. I still monitor that section of the valley as part of my ongoing research. The cameras continue to document normal wildlife activity, seasonal patterns, the kind of data that helps us understand how animals adapt to environmental changes. But sometimes, when I'm reviewing footage from the early morning hours, I find myself checking the timestamp more carefully than I need to, because I wonder if Robert Hayes ever finished whatever journey he was making through those mountains, if he ever reached the destination that called him back night after night. I wonder what was in that bundle he carried so carefully, and whether he's still out there somewhere, walking paths that don't appear on any map, following routes that connect the world we can document to places where the familiar rules don't seem to apply. I'm Emma Rodriguez, and I've been working seasonal positions for the National Park Service for 7 years. Most of that time has been spent at remote stations where you might go days without seeing another person, just you and the radio and whatever paperwork needs updating. The Cascade Creek Station, where I was posted in the summer of 2022, is about as isolated as they get, 12 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by foot, trail, or helicopter. The station itself is a small log building with basic communication equipment, first aid supplies, and information for the handful of backpackers who make it that far into the wilderness each season. It's positioned at the junction of 3 trails, so part of my job is helping people navigate the area and making sure they're prepared for the more difficult terrain ahead. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late August when the man appeared at my station. I'd been working on trail condition reports when I heard footsteps on the wooden porch outside. Not unusual hikers often stop by to check their route or ask about water sources, but when I looked up from my paperwork, something about him made me pause. He was probably in his 40s, wearing hiking gear that looked well used but not particularly modern. His clothes had that faded quality that comes from years of sun exposure, and his boots showed the kind of wear you get from serious backcountry travel. What struck me immediately was how tired he looked, not just physically, but in a deeper way, like someone who'd been walking for much longer than any day hike would account for. "Excuse me," he said, stepping up to the counter that separates the public area from my workspace. "I'm trying to get to the Devil's Backbone Trail. My map shows it should be accessible from here, but I haven't been able to find the trailhead." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The Devil's Backbone Trail had been permanently closed in 2007 after a section of the ridge collapsed during a spring thaw, killing 2 hikers. The closure was well documented, with signs posted at all the approach routes and warnings in every trail guide published since then. "I'm sorry, but that trail has been closed for 15 years, I told him. "There was a fatal rockfall, and the area is considered too unstable for public access." He looked genuinely confused, not like someone who was trying to access restricted area despite knowing the risks, but like someone hearing this information for the first time. He pulled out a topographic map and spread it on the counter between us. The map was definitely outdated. I could tell immediately from the trail markings and the publication date printed in the corner, 2006. It showed the Devil's Backbone Trail clearly marked as an established route, with elevation profiles and mileage markers that matched my own knowledge of the area from before the closure. "This doesn't show any closure," he said, pointing to the trail marking. "I've been planning this hike for months. The Devil's Backbone is supposed to connect with the High Lakes Loop, and from there I can get back to my car at the Salmon Creek trailhead." I studied his face while he talked. trying to understand why someone would be carrying a map that was 16 years out of date and planning a route that had been impossible to complete for over a decade. He didn't look like someone playing games or testing my knowledge of the area. He looked like a hiker who was genuinely lost and increasingly concerned about his situation. "When did you start your hike?" I asked, thinking maybe he'd been in the backcountry longer than usual and had lost track of current conditions. "Yesterday morning," he said. "Left from Salmon Creek around 6 a.m., planning to be back by Thursday evening. But nothing looks the way it should according to my map, and I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere." That's when I noticed something that made my chest tighten with unease. His description of the hike timeline and route planning sounded familiar, not from recent conversations with visitors, but from something I'd seen in my station's files. I excused myself and went to the bulletin board, where we kept information about ongoing searches and missing persons cases. There, pinned to the corkboard where it had been since I'd started working at Cascade Creek, was a missing person flyer, with a photograph that matched the man standing at my counter. The flyer was dated August 23, 2011, and it described a 41-year-old hiker named David Chen, who had disappeared while attempting to hike the Devil's Backbone Trail. Last seen leaving the Salmon Creek trailhead, planning to return by Thursday evening. 11 years ago, I looked back at the man, then at the flyer, then back at the man. The physical resemblance was unmistakable, same facial structure, same build, even wearing the same style of clothing shown in the missing person photo. But the timeline made no sense. The missing person report was from 2011. It was now 2022. "Can I see some identification?" I asked, trying to keep my voice professional despite the growing confusion. He reached for his wallet and handed me a driver's license. David Chen, with an address in Seattle and an expiration date of August 2012. The photo matched both the man standing in front of me and the missing person flyer. But David Chen had been missing for 11 years. I felt like I was trapped in some kind of administrative error or elaborate confusion. Maybe this was a relative with the same name. Maybe the missing person case had been resolved and the flyer had never been updated. But the details were too specific, too exact. Same name, same planned route, same hiking schedule, even the same outdated map that would have been current when the original David Chen had disappeared. "Mr. Chen," I said carefully, "I need to radio my supervisor about your situation. There may be some kind of mix-up in our records." He nodded, but I could see concern growing in his expression. "Is something wrong? I know I'm off route, but it's not like I'm in immediate danger. I just need to find the right trail to get back to my car." I reached for the radio to contact the district office, thinking they would need to sort out whatever administrative error had led to this situation. But when I looked up to tell David Chen that help was on the way, he was gone. I stepped outside immediately, looking in all directions from the station porch. The nearest tree cover was at least 50 yards away, and the terrain around the station is open enough that anyone walking away would be visible for several minutes. But I saw nothing. No sign of movement, no sound of footsteps, no indication of which direction he might have gone. I radioed the district office anyway, reporting the encounter and requesting clarification about the missing person case from 2011. The response I got made everything more confusing rather than less. David Chen's case had never been resolved. He was still officially listed as missing, presumed dead after 11 years, with no trace found, despite extensive search efforts. His family had held a memorial service in 2013, but his status remained unchanged in the official records. I described my encounter in detail, but I could hear the skepticism in my supervisor's voice. Missing persons don't reappear after 11 years asking for directions to trails that have been closed since before they disappeared. Seasonal rangers working alone in remote stations sometimes experience stress-related confusion or isolation effects that can affect judgment and perception. But I knew what I had seen. I had David Chen's driver's license information written in my daily log, copied directly from the identification he'd shown me. I had the exact details of our conversation documented in my incident report. And I had the missing person flyer that had been hanging in my station for years, showing a photograph that matched the man who'd asked me for directions to a trail he couldn't possibly have been trying to reach. The official response was that I should report any future encounters immediately and avoid engaging with individuals who might be suffering from psychological distress or confusion. The incident was filed as a possible case of mistaken identity or misunderstanding. But I kept thinking about David Chen's confusion when I told him the Devil's Backbone Trail had been closed. The genuine surprise in his voice, the way he'd consulted his outdated map, like he was trying to reconcile conflicting information. He hadn't seemed confused or distressed. He'd seemed like someone who was exactly where and when he thought he should be, asking for help with a perfectly reasonable navigation problem. I worked at Cascade Creek for another month before the end of the season, and I found myself checking the missing person flyer every day, comparing the photograph to my memory of the man who'd visited my station. The resemblance never became less striking, and the details never stopped matching exactly. On my last day at the station, I took down the missing person flyer and read it more carefully than I ever had before. David Chen, 41 years old, experienced hiker, last seen August 23, 2011, heading for the Devil's Backbone Trail. The physical description matched perfectly. The planned route matched what he'd told me. Even the timeline matched, leaving early on a Tuesday, planning to return Thursday evening. I've worked at 3 different stations since then, but I still think about that encounter more often than I should. About David Chen standing at my counter with his outdated map, asking for directions to a trail that had been closed since before he disappeared. About the way he'd vanished from the station area without a trace, exactly the way he'd vanished from the Devil's Backbone Trail 11 years earlier. I wonder if he ever found what he was looking for, if he's still out there somewhere, trying to complete a hike that was interrupted over a decade ago. I wonder if time works differently in the spaces between the marked trails, if some journeys continue even after the people making them have been given up for lost. And I wonder if I'll see him again someday, at another remote station, still carrying his 2006 map, still looking for a trail that leads somewhere the rest of us can't follow. I'm Jake Morrison, and I've been patrolling the backcountry areas of Rocky Mountain National Park for 15 years. You learn to trust your ears out there. Sound carries differently in mountain terrain, and being able to identify what you're hearing can mean the difference between finding someone in time and conducting a recovery operation. Wind through rock formations, animal calls, the distinct sound of someone in distress, they all have their own signatures if you know how to listen. In September of 2021, I started getting reports about voices coming from Devil's Canyon, a steep-walled gorge about 10 miles northwest of the main visitor center. The canyon had gained an unfortunate reputation the previous summer when 3 experienced hikers fell to their deaths during a day hike. Technical rescue teams had recovered the bodies, but the incident had led to increased restrictions on access to that area. The first report came from a group of college students who'd been camping near the canyon rim. They told me they'd heard someone calling for help from down in the gorge, but when they looked over the edge, they couldn't see anyone. The calls had continued for about 10 minutes. Always the same voice, always the same words, before stopping abruptly. "What exactly did you hear?" I asked, taking down their report at the Bear Lake Ranger Station. "Someone yelling, 'Tell them I made it home,'" one of the students said, over and over again. "We thought maybe someone had fallen and was trying to get our attention, but we couldn't see anything when we looked down." I made a note to check the area during my next patrol, thinking it was probably an injured hiker who'd managed to find shelter somewhere out of sight. Devil's Canyon is full of hidden ledges and alcoves where someone could be stranded but not visible from the rim. The message itself was odd, not the usual calls for help you'd expect from someone in immediate danger, but people in distress don't always communicate clearly. 2 days later, I hiked out to Devil's Canyon with climbing gear and a partner from the technical rescue team. We rappelled down the north face to check the areas where someone might have fallen or gotten trapped. Found nothing. No signs of recent human activity. No gear left behind. No indication that anyone had been in the canyon recently. But while we were down there, we heard it ourselves. Around 3:30 in the afternoon, a voice echoed off the canyon walls from somewhere above us, clear as day, unmistakably human. "Tell them I made it home." The voice repeated the same phrase maybe 8 or 10 times before falling silent. My partner and I looked at each other, both of us trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. The acoustics in the canyon create complex echo patterns, so it's often difficult to determine the exact source of a sound, but the voice seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once, bouncing off the rock faces in ways that made no geographical sense. We climbed back up and searched the rim area thoroughly, found no one, no footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no signs that anyone had been standing at the edge of the canyon calling down. The closest trail was over a mile away, and the terrain between the trail and the canyon rim was rough enough that reaching it would require deliberate effort and some basic climbing skills. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 4 more reports of the same phenomenon. Different groups, different days, but always the same details. A voice calling from Devil's Canyon around 3:30 in the afternoon, always repeating the same phrase. "Tell them I made it home." The reports were consistent enough that I started planning more systematic investigation. I positioned myself at different points around the canyon rim during the time period when the voice was usually heard, trying to triangulate the source. But every time I heard it, the sound seemed to come from a different location. Sometimes from the canyon floor, sometimes from the opposite rim, sometimes from empty air above the gorge. What really bothered me was the timing. Not approximately 3:30, but exactly 3:30. Down to the minute, according to multiple witnesses with different watches and phones. Natural phenomena don't follow that kind of precision. And even if someone was deliberately making the calls, maintaining such exact timing would require careful coordination and planning. After 3 weeks of reports, I decided to bring in acoustic equipment to try to record and analyze the voice. Set up directional microphones at 3 different positions around the canyon, synchronized to capture whatever was creating these sounds from multiple angles. On October 15th, at exactly 3:32 p.m., all 3 microphones recorded the same voice, calling out the familiar phrase. The recordings were clear enough for professional analysis, so I sent them to a forensic audio specialist who works with our investigation unit. The results made me reconsider everything I thought I understood about what was happening in Devil's Canyon. According to the acoustic analysis, the voice patterns matched recordings from the previous year's search and rescue operation. During the recovery of the 3 hikers who'd fallen to their deaths, family members had provided voice samples to help identify any potential calls for help that might have been missed during the initial search. The voice calling, "Tell them I made it home," belonged to Michael Torres, one of the hikers who died in the canyon 13 months earlier. I pulled the case files from the previous year's incident to compare the audio samples. Michael Torres, 28 years old, from Denver, experienced hiker who'd been leading a day trip with 2 friends when they'd encountered unstable rock conditions near the canyon rim. All 3 had fallen approximately 200 feet. The medical examiner had determined they died on impact. The voice match was definitive according to the forensic analysis. Same vocal patterns, same speech rhythms, same distinctive accent that Michael's family had described in their statements. But Michael Torres had been dead for over a year. I reported the findings to my supervisor, expecting him to question the reliability of the audio analysis or suggest alternative explanations. Instead, he asked me to continue monitoring the situation, but to keep the voice identification confidential, pending further investigation. "There might be a rational explanation," he said. "Equipment malfunction, atmospheric effects, even someone playing recordings. But until we know more, we don't want to cause unnecessary distress to the families involved." I continued my patrols of Devil's Canyon through the fall, recording the voice whenever it appeared and documenting the exact timing and conditions. The pattern never varied. 3:30 p.m., same voice, same message, lasting approximately 10 minutes before stopping abruptly. What I found most disturbing wasn't the impossibility of a dead person's voice echoing through the canyon, but the content of the message itself. Tell them I made it home. Not a call for help, not an expression of distress, but a statement of completion, of having reached some destination. During the original search and rescue operation, Michael Torres's family had described him as someone who'd always been drawn to remote places, someone who'd talked about finding locations where he could feel truly connected to the wilderness. His girlfriend had mentioned that he'd often said he wanted to find a place in the mountains where he could feel at home. In November, as winter weather began to make the canyon inaccessible, I made one final trip to document the voice phenomenon, set up my equipment at 325, and waited for the familiar call. It came as expected, but this time, there was something different about it. The voice was fainter, less distinct, like it was coming from much farther away. And instead of the usual 10 repetitions, I only heard the phrase 3 times before it faded completely. That was the last time anyone reported hearing the voice in Devil's Canyon. Winter snows closed the area for the season, and when I resumed patrols the following spring, the canyon was silent except for wind and the occasional call of raptors riding the thermals. The official report on the voice phenomenon was filed as unexplained acoustic effects, possibly related to canyon topography and atmospheric conditions. The voice identification was noted but not emphasized, and no mention was made of the connection to the previous year's fatalities. I still patrol Devil's Canyon regularly as part of my assigned territory. It's a beautiful area despite its tragic history, and the hiking restrictions have been relaxed as new safety protocols have been implemented. But I always check my watch when I'm there in the late afternoon, and I still find myself listening more carefully than I need to during the time period when Michael Torres used to call out his message. Sometimes I wonder if he really did make it home. If the place he'd been looking for his whole life was somewhere in that canyon, somewhere the rest of us can't follow. I wonder if his final message was exactly what it seemed to be, not a cry for help, but a notification that he'd finally found what he'd been searching for. The acoustic equipment never recorded the voice again after that final session in November. But every time I stand at the rim of Devil's Canyon and look down into the shadows between the rock walls, I think about Michael Torres and his friends, and about the difference between falling into a place and finally arriving there. And I listen, just in case he has something else to tell us about whatever destination he found in the depths of that canyon, something important enough to call out across the boundary between where we are and where he went. I'm Rebecca Walsh, and I've been coordinating supply logistics for the Glacier National Park System for 12 years. Most people don't think much about what goes into keeping remote ranger stations and emergency caches stocked, but it's a complex operation that requires careful tracking of every item, every location, every access point. When something appears in the system that shouldn't be there, you notice immediately. In June of 2023, I was conducting my annual inventory of emergency supply caches throughout the backcountry. These are pre-positioned supplies, food, medical equipment, communication devices stored in weatherproof containers at strategic locations for use during search and rescue operations or emergency situations. Each cache is GPS located, documented, and checked twice a year to ensure the contents remain viable. I was working through the northern sector when my GPS led me to coordinates that showed a cache I didn't recognize. According to my records, there shouldn't have been any emergency supplies at that location. It was too far from established trails and too close to existing caches to justify the redundancy. But the GPS reading was clear, and when I reached the coordinates, I found a supply container that looked identical to our standard equipment. The container was a heavy-duty plastic case, the same model we use for all our emergency caches, positioned under a rock overhang that provided natural weather protection. It was properly secured and camouflaged, showing the kind of professional placement that indicated someone with wilderness training and knowledge of our standard procedures. When I opened it, I found it fully stocked with supplies that met or exceeded our normal cache standards. High-quality emergency food with expiration dates extending into 2025. Comprehensive first aid supplies, water purification tablets, emergency blankets, even a handheld radio that was compatible with our communication system. Everything was organized and sealed exactly the way our staff would have done it, but I had no record of authorizing this cache. No purchase orders for the supplies, no work orders for the placement. Someone had created a professional-grade emergency supply point using equipment and methods that matched our protocols perfectly, but they'd done it without any involvement from my office. I photographed everything and made detailed notes before disturbing the contents. At the bottom of the container, under the organized supply layers, I found something that made me sit down hard on a nearby boulder and stare at the contents for a long time. There were maps, detailed topographic maps of the surrounding area, but they weren't the standard Park Service maps available to the public. These were working maps, the kind we use for search operations, with hand-marked notations covering the past 5 years of activity in the region. Each map was covered with small red X marks, and next to each mark was a date and initials. It took me a few minutes to recognize what I was looking at, but when I did, my hands started shaking enough that I had to set the maps down and take a break. The marks corresponded to locations where people had gone missing in the glacier backcountry. Every major disappearance from the past 5 years was marked and dated with precision that indicated whoever had created these maps had intimate knowledge of our search and rescue operations. I pulled out my own maps and cross-referenced the marked locations with my memory of recent cases. Sarah Chen, missing August 2019, marked at the exact coordinates where her abandoned backpack had been found. Michael Rodriguez, disappeared June 2020, marked at the precise location where his trail had gone cold. Jennifer Walsh, no relation, despite the shared surname, missing September 2021, marked at the spot where search teams had found her camera, but no other trace. 15 different disappearances, each one marked with the accuracy that comes from either having been present during the search operations or having access to detailed case files that aren't available to the general public. But what made my chest tight with unease wasn't just the comprehensive documentation of missing persons cases. It was the pattern that emerged when I looked at all the marked locations together. The red X marks, when connected by imaginary lines, formed a perfect spiral pattern centered roughly on the location where I was sitting. Not a rough approximation of a spiral, but a mathematically precise pattern that suggested deliberate planning and systematic execution over a period of years. I photographed the maps and packed everything back into the container exactly as I'd found it, then hiked directly back to the district office to report the discovery. My supervisor, Frank Martinez, listened to my description with the kind of professional attention he gives to all unusual findings, but I could see the confusion and concern growing in his expression as I explained what I'd found. We pulled the case files for all 15 marked disappearances and compared them to the locations on the maps. The accuracy was perfect. Whoever had created those maps had information that should have been restricted to search and rescue personnel and investigating officers. More disturbing was the realization that the spiral pattern wasn't random. The dates on the marks showed a progression that followed the spiral from the outside in, like someone had been working their way systematically toward the center point where the cache was located. The earliest disappearance, marked August 2018, was at the outermost point of the spiral. The most recent, dated March 2023, was less than 2 miles from the cache location. Frank assigned a team to investigate the cache site and the surrounding area for any signs of who might have placed it there. They found evidence of someone having visited the location regularly over an extended period, worn pathways that didn't correspond to any established trails, areas where vegetation had been cleared for better sightlines, even what appeared to be a concealed observation post about a quarter-mile away. The observation post was the most unsettling discovery. Someone had created a camouflaged shelter with clear views of several approach routes to the cache location. Inside, investigators found more maps, these ones showing detailed trail patterns and camping areas throughout the northern sector. There were also logbooks documenting wildlife movements, weather patterns, and what appeared to be regular observations of hiking traffic in the area. The logs went back 3 years and showed meticulous record-keeping of everyone who'd passed through the area during that time. Descriptions of hikers, their routes, their equipment, their apparent skill levels. Hundreds of entries documenting the movements of people who had no idea they were being observed and cataloged. But the investigation found no clear evidence of who had been maintaining this elaborate observation and supply system. No fingerprints, no DNA evidence, no personal items that might indicate identity. Just the careful work of someone with extensive wilderness skills and intimate knowledge of our operational procedures. The cache was removed and turned over to law enforcement as potential evidence in the missing persons cases. The FBI opened an investigation to determine if there was a connection between the documented disappearances and whoever had been systematically tracking and mapping them. But after 6 months of investigation, no arrests were made and no definitive connections were established. The official conclusion was that someone with an obsessive interest in missing persons cases had been conducting their own research and surveillance, possibly someone with a background in search and rescue who had become fixated on unsolved disappearances. I returned to my normal supply coordination duties, but I found myself paying closer attention to discrepancies in our inventory system and unauthorized activity in the backcountry. The experience had made me realize how much we don't know about who's out there in the wilderness areas, watching and documenting and planning things we can't anticipate. What bothers me most isn't the violation of our supply systems, or even the invasion of privacy represented by the surveillance operation. It's the spiral pattern formed by those 15 disappearances, and the realization that whoever created those maps was working towards something at the center of that pattern. The cache location where I'd been sitting when I discovered the maps was at the exact center of the spiral. Someone had spent years documenting missing persons cases that formed a precise geometric pattern, and they'd positioned their main supply point at the focal point of that pattern. I think about that sometimes when I'm working alone in the backcountry, especially when I'm in areas that aren't frequently visited by other hikers. I think about the observation post and the detailed logs of everyone who'd passed through that area, and I wonder if there are other watchers out there, other people systematically documenting movements and patterns that the rest of us don't see. And I think about the spiral, about the progression from the outside in, about what might happen when someone reaches the center of a pattern that's been 5 years in the making. Because the most recent mark on those maps was only 3 months old, and the spiral wasn't complete yet. There was still space for more marks, more disappearances, more progression toward whatever conclusion someone had been planning all along. I'm Carlos Vega, and I've been working security for the National Park Service for 8 years. Most of that time has been spent on day shifts at visitor centers and parking areas. But in October of 2023, I was assigned to solo night security at Tower Rock, a restricted climbing area in Joshua Tree National Park. The area had been closed to public access after a series of fatal accidents, and my job was to monitor the perimeter and prevent unauthorized entry. Tower Rock is a massive granite formation that attracts serious climbers from around the world, but it's also claimed 17 lives since 2010. Falls, equipment failures, medical emergencies. The rock has a reputation that keeps casual climbers away and draws the experienced ones who think they can handle the technical challenges. After the last fatality in September, the Park Service decided to restrict access while they conducted a comprehensive safety review. The security station is a small trailer positioned about a quarter-mile from the rock formation, equipped with a bank of monitors connected to cameras that cover all the main approach routes. Standard overnight security work: watch the screens, check the perimeter every few hours, log any unusual activity, Most nights, the biggest excitement was watching coyotes move through the camera range or dealing with the occasional lost hiker who'd wandered too far from the established trails. My first 2 weeks on the Tower Rock assignment were routine, quiet nights. No unauthorized climbing attempts, just the usual desert wildlife and the kind of deep silence that comes with being alone in the wilderness after dark. The camera system was reliable, the radio worked fine, and I was settling into the rhythm of solo night shift work. It was on my third Monday that I first noticed him. Around 2:30 a.m., movement on camera 4 caught my attention. A lone figure, walking along the base of Tower Rock, moving with the steady pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going. The infrared imaging showed a person carrying what appeared to be a small pack or bag, but the resolution wasn't clear enough to make out specific details. I switched to the other cameras to track the figure's movement. He was following a route that took him to specific locations around the rock formation, stopping for a few minutes at each spot before moving on to the next. The pattern seemed deliberate, purposeful, like he was visiting predetermined waypoints rather than exploring randomly. What made me pay closer attention was that several of his stops corresponded to locations I recognized from the incident reports. The ledge where a climber had fallen in March of 2021. The base of the route where someone had died from a heart attack in August of 2020. The boulder field where a rappelling accident had occurred in May of 2022. I radioed the ranger station to report unauthorized activity in the restricted area, but by the time backup could arrive, the figure had disappeared beyond the camera range. When the rangers searched the area at first light, they found no signs of recent human activity, no footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no equipment left behind. I reviewed the recorded footage with my supervisor the next day, but the infrared imaging didn't provide enough detail for identification. We could see that someone had definitely been there, and the timing and route were clear, but there wasn't much to go on for an investigation. 3 nights later, he came back. Same time, same systematic route around the base of Tower Rock. Same stops at locations that had been sites of fatal accidents. But this time, I was prepared with better equipment. I'd brought binoculars with infrared capability and positioned myself where I could observe directly while still monitoring the camera feeds. What I saw through the binoculars made me understand why the morning searches had found no trace of the nighttime visitor. At each stop, the figure appeared to be placing something on the ground, small objects that he removed from his pack with careful, deliberate movements. Flowers, I realized. He was leaving flowers at each location where someone had died. When I checked those spots the next morning before filing my report, I found fresh wildflowers placed precisely at the coordinates that corresponded to the accident sites. Desert marigolds, brittlebush, ghost plants, native species that someone would have had to collect from other areas of the park. Each arrangement was small but carefully composed, positioned as if marking a memorial or gravesite. I started keeping detailed logs of the figure's visits, noting the timing, route, and duration of each appearance. The pattern was remarkably consistent every 4th night, arriving around 2:30 a.m., visiting each accident site in chronological order based on when the fatalities had occurred. The visits lasted exactly 90 minutes, and the figure always departed via the same route that took him beyond the range of our cameras. After 6 weeks of documented visits, I'd accumulated enough footage to see patterns that weren't obvious from individual sightings. The figure moved with familiarity that suggested extensive knowledge of the area. He navigated the terrain without hesitation, even in complete darkness, and never appeared to use artificial light sources that would have been visible on the cameras. More importantly, I realized he was visiting sites that weren't marked or documented anywhere in the public record. Some of the stops he made corresponded to accidents that had been classified as medical emergencies or equipment failures, incidents that wouldn't necessarily be known to casual observers or climbing enthusiasts researching the area's history. I pulled the complete incident files for Tower Rock fatalities going back to 2010 and cross-referenced them with the locations where I'd observed the figure stopping. Every single stop corresponded to a fatality site, including several that had received minimal publicity and one that had been officially classified as an unrelated medical emergency. Whoever was making these nighttime visits had comprehensive knowledge of every death that had occurred at Tower Rock over more than a decade, including details that weren't available in publicly accessible reports. I shared my findings with the investigation team, thinking we might be dealing with a family member or friend of one of the victims who was conducting private memorial visits. But when they cross-referenced the victim database with the physical description I could provide from the camera footage, no obvious connections emerged. The figure appeared to be a middle-aged male, medium build, moving with the confidence and agility that suggested climbing experience. But none of the Tower Rock fatalities involved family members or close associates who matched that description, and who would have had access to the detailed location information that the visits demonstrated. After 2 months of regular documentation, the visits stopped as abruptly as they'd started. My last sighting was on December 15th, same time and route as always, but after that night, the figure never returned. I continued monitoring the area through the winter and into the following spring when my assignment ended, but the cameras never recorded another unauthorized visit. The flowers continued to appear, though, even without any visible human activity. Fresh flower arrangements kept appearing at the fatality sites every few weeks. Park maintenance crews reported finding them during routine patrols, always the same native species, arranged with the same careful attention to placement and composition. The official explanation was that we were dealing with someone who had developed an emotional connection to the Tower Rock fatalities and was conducting private memorial activities during times when they could avoid detection. The flower placements were noted as a form of grieving or remembrance that wasn't inherently harmful to park resources. But I keep thinking about the systematic nature of those visits, the comprehensive knowledge of every fatality location, and the way the figure moved through that terrain with complete confidence in total darkness. 17 people had died at Tower Rock over the past decade, and someone was making sure that each death was remembered and marked with the kind of personal attention usually reserved for immediate family. I've worked security in a lot of different environments since then, but I still think about those nighttime vigils at Tower Rock, about someone who felt compelled to visit every place where a life had ended, carrying flowers through the desert darkness to mark deaths that might otherwise be forgotten by everyone except the families involved. And I wonder who takes on that kind of responsibility, who decides that every death deserves regular remembrance, regardless of whether they knew the person who died. I wonder if he's still out there somewhere, keeping watch over other places where people have died alone in the wilderness, making sure they're not forgotten by someone who understands what it means to die in the mountains or the desert. Sometimes, when I'm working night shifts in remote areas, I find myself checking the shadows more carefully than I need to, looking for someone moving with purpose through the darkness. Not because I'm afraid, but because I think there's something important about what I witnessed at Tower Rock, something about the way grief and memory can take forms that the rest of us don't recognize or understand. I'm Sophie Park, and I've been working digital evidence analysis for the Washington State Patrol for 9 years. Most of my job involves extracting data from damaged devices, phones recovered from car accidents, computers seized in investigations, storage devices that have been deliberately destroyed. When the Park Service sends me equipment recovered from missing persons cases, it's usually for standard data recovery to help with search operations or to provide closure for families. In November of 2022, I received a smartphone that had been found by hikers in the North Cascades, about 6 miles off the established trail system. The phone belonged to Amanda Chen, a 34-year-old software engineer from Seattle who'd been reported missing 3 weeks earlier when she failed to return from a solo day hike. The device had been exposed to weather but was still functional, and the rangers hoped it might contain location data or other information that could help locate Amanda. Standard procedure for missing persons cases is to extract all available data: GPS logs, text messages, call records, Photos, videos, anything that might provide clues about the person's movements or state of mind before they disappeared. The phone had significant water damage, but the memory was intact, so I was able to recover most of the stored content. Amanda's photo gallery showed typical hiking documentation, trail markers, scenic overlooks, wildlife sightings. Her GPS data indicated she'd followed the established trail for the first 8 miles before veering off into unmarked terrain. Text messages showed she'd been in regular contact with friends and family leading up to the hike, with no indication of personal problems or risky behavior. But there was one video file that made me pause and replay the footage several times before calling my supervisor. The video was recorded on the day Amanda disappeared, according to the metadata timestamp. It showed her sitting on what appeared to be a fallen log in a forest clearing, looking directly at the camera with a relaxed, pleasant expression. She was clearly speaking to someone, having what seemed to be a normal conversation, occasionally laughing and nodding as if responding to questions or comments. I know, she said at one point, smiling at something off camera. You've been saying that for hours, but I'm not ready yet. This place is beautiful, and I want to stay a little longer. She paused, listening to something I couldn't hear, then shook her head with good-natured firmness. No, seriously, just give me a few more minutes. I promise I'll come with you soon, but let me finish documenting this area first. My friends are never going to believe how amazing it is out here. The conversation continued for about 4 minutes, with Amanda responding to what appeared to be persistent requests or suggestions from someone positioned behind the camera. Her tone remained friendly, but showed increasing signs of gentle resistance to whatever was being proposed. Look, I appreciate that you want to help me get back, she said toward the end of the video. But I've been hiking for years, and I know how to find my way. I'll head back to the trail in just a few minutes, okay? Stop worrying so much. The video ended with Amanda waving at the camera and saying, Fine, I'll start packing up, but you owe me dinner for cutting this short. What made this footage disturbing wasn't the content of Amanda's conversation, which seemed normal enough for someone talking to a hiking companion. It was what the audio analysis revealed when I processed it through enhanced filtering equipment. Amanda Chen was alone during that entire conversation. The audio track contained only her voice, recorded with the clarity and isolation that indicates a single speaker in an outdoor environment. There were no other voices, no background conversations, no indication of anyone else being present during the recording. But Amanda's responses, her pauses for listening, her reactions to unheard comments, everything suggested she was engaged in active dialogue with someone who wasn't there. I ran the audio through multiple analysis programs, checking for frequency ranges that might indicate voices too low or distorted for normal hearing. Found nothing. I examined the video frame by frame, looking for any visual indication of another person in the area: shadows, reflections, movement in the background. The footage showed Amanda alone in an empty forest clearing, but her behavior throughout the video was completely consistent with someone having a real-time conversation with another person. She made eye contact with specific points off camera, waited for responses before continuing to speak, reacted to unheard questions with appropriate emotional responses. If I hadn't known from the audio analysis that she was alone, I would have assumed she was talking to a hiking companion. I consulted with a forensic psychologist who specializes in analyzing evidence from missing persons cases. She reviewed the footage and confirmed that Amanda's conversational behavior showed none of the typical signs of someone experiencing psychological distress, hallucinations, or acute mental health episodes. Her speech patterns were clear and rational. Her emotional responses were appropriate to the content of her conversation, and she showed no signs of confusion or disorientation. According to the professional assessment, Amanda appeared to be having a pleasant, normal conversation with someone she knew and trusted. Someone who was asking her to leave the area and come home with them, but who she felt comfortable declining, at least temporarily. The investigation team used the GPS data from Amanda's phone to locate the exact clearing where the video had been recorded. They found the fallen log where she'd been sitting, along with some disturbed ground that indicated she'd spent time in the area organizing her gear. But there were no footprints or other signs that anyone else had been present. Amanda Chen was never found. The search continued for 2 more weeks after the phone was discovered, but no additional evidence was located. The case remains open, but with no new leads or information, it's effectively dormant. I submitted my technical analysis as part of the official case file, but I kept a copy of the video for my own review. I've watched it probably 50 times since then, trying to understand what I was seeing and hearing. Amanda's conversation makes perfect sense if you assume she's talking to another person. Her responses are contextually appropriate, her emotional reactions are genuine, and her final agreement to start packing up suggests she was convinced by whatever arguments the other person was making. But the audio evidence is definitive. She was alone in that clearing. I've analyzed hundreds of videos from missing persons cases, and I know the difference between normal behavior and signs of psychological distress. Amanda Chen was not experiencing hallucinations or delusions during that recording. She was having a real conversation with someone she could see and hear, someone who wanted her to come home with them, someone who wasn't there. The most unsettling aspect of the video isn't the impossible conversation, though that's disturbing enough. It's the tone of familiarity in Amanda's voice, the way she interacts with this invisible presence, as if it's someone she knows well. She's comfortable declining their requests, joking with them, negotiating for more time. This isn't a threatening encounter or a frightening experience. It's a friendly conversation with someone she trusts completely, someone who convinced her to pack up and leave with them, and who she apparently did follow, since that's the last record we have of Amanda Chen's activities in the North Cascades. I think about that video whenever I'm working on evidence recovery from wilderness missing persons cases. I think about the difference between what the camera recorded and what the audio captured, and what that might mean about the reliability of our technical analysis methods. But mostly, I think about Amanda's final words in the video, the cheerful resignation in her voice when she agreed to pack up and leave. Fine, I'll start packing up, but you owe me dinner for cutting this short. Like she was talking to an old friend who'd come to bring her home from a place she'd been enjoying too much to leave voluntarily. Like she knew this person well enough to make jokes and negotiate terms, even though the person wasn't there. Like coming home was something she wanted to do once she was convinced it was time to go. I wonder where Amanda went that day, and who she went with, and whether she ever got that dinner she was promised. I wonder if she made it home, whatever that meant to her, and whoever was calling her there from a place the rest of us can't see, or hear, or understand. I'm Ryan Foster, and I've been monitoring environmental conditions in the Alaskan wilderness for 16 years. Most of my work involves tracking changes in permafrost stability, groundwater patterns, and soil temperature fluctuations that help us understand how climate change is affecting the northern ecosystems. It's methodical work that requires long periods alone in remote areas, installing equipment and collecting data that becomes part of larger climate research projects. In August of 2023, I was conducting routine maintenance on temperature monitoring stations in the Brooks Range, about 40 miles north of the Arctic Circle. These stations record ground temperature data at various depths, helping us track permafrost thaw patterns that have accelerated significantly over the past decade. The data gets transmitted via satellite to research centers, where scientists analyze long-term trends and environmental impacts. I was checking Station 17, located in a valley that had been showing unusual temperature readings for the past 3 months. Instead of the gradual, seasonal variations we normally see in permafrost monitoring, this location was recording dramatic fluctuations that didn't match any known environmental patterns. The data showed periods of rapid warming, followed by sudden temperature drops, cycling in ways that suggested something other than normal thermal processes. When I reached the station, the equipment was functioning normally, but the ground conditions around it were unlike anything I'd seen in 16 years of permafrost research. An area roughly 20 feet by 15 feet had thawed completely, creating a perfect rectangle of soft soil surrounded by permanently frozen ground that should have remained stable for decades. Permafrost doesn't thaw in geometric patterns. When ground ice melts, it creates irregular shapes determined by drainage, vegetation, soil composition, and local topography. But this thawed section looked deliberately created, with straight edges and precise corners that defied every natural process I understood. I took soil temperature readings across the site and found that the thawed area was consistently warmer than the surrounding permafrost, but not warm enough to explain how it had melted so completely. The temperature differential was only about 5 degrees, nowhere near sufficient to cause the kind of comprehensive thaw I was observing. As I was setting up additional monitoring equipment, I noticed something reflecting sunlight from the exposed soil. I knelt down to investigate and found a piece of metal partially buried in the thawed ground. When I brushed away the dirt, I was looking at a wristwatch, tarnished but intact, still attached to a leather band that had been preserved by the frozen conditions. The watch was engraved on the back. "Happy 30th birthday, Michael. Love, Janet. June 1987. I photographed the watch and its location before carefully removing it from the soil. As I searched the area more systematically, I found other objects scattered throughout the thawed rectangle. A pair of eyeglasses with a distinctive blue frame, a silver locket containing a photograph of 2 children, a hiking boot that looked like it had been expensive when it was new, a wallet, empty except for a driver's license issued in 1994. Each item was personal, the kind of thing someone would carry with them on a camping trip or hiking expedition. But they were from different time periods, different decades, arranged in the thawed soil as if they'd been placed there deliberately, rather than lost or abandoned randomly. I spent the rest of the day documenting everything I found. 12 different personal items, ranging in apparent age from the 1980s to the early 2000s. Each object was photographed in place before being carefully collected and cataloged. The distribution pattern showed no obvious logic. Expensive items mixed with everyday objects, men's and women's belongings, scattered randomly throughout the thawed area. When I returned to my base station that evening, I researched the names and information I'd found on the recovered items. What I discovered made me sit down hard and stare at my laptop screen for a long time. Every single item corresponded to someone who'd been reported missing in the Alaska wilderness over the past 40 years. The wristwatch belonged to Michael Torres, who'd disappeared during a solo camping trip in July of 1991. The eyeglasses matched the prescription and frame description for Sarah Kim, missing since August of 2002. The driver's license had been issued to Robert Chen, who'd vanished while hiking the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in September of 1994. I cross-referenced each item with missing persons databases maintained by the Alaska State Troopers and found connections for all 12 objects. People who disappeared during backcountry adventures, solo hikes, research expeditions, cases that had never been solved, families who'd never received closure about what had happened to their loved ones. But the location where I'd found these items was hundreds of miles from where most of these people had gone missing. Michael Torres had disappeared near Denali. Sarah Kim had been hiking in the Chugach Mountains. Robert Chen had been in the Arctic Refuge. None of them had any documented connection to the remote valley, where their personal belongings were now buried in thawed permafrost. I reported my findings to the Alaska State Troopers and provided detailed documentation of everything I'd discovered. The investigation team confirmed the identity connections and opened a comprehensive review of the related missing persons cases. But after 3 months of investigation, they had no explanation for how items from 12 different people, missing across 4 decades, had ended up buried together in a section of permafrost that had thawed in perfect geometric patterns. The official conclusion was that someone had been collecting these items over an extended period and had buried them in the remote location for unknown reasons. Possibly a family member or researcher who'd acquired the belongings through estate sales or other legitimate means and had chosen to enter them in a kind of memorial or remembrance site. But that explanation didn't account for the permafrost thaw pattern, which remained unexplained by any known environmental process. The temperature monitoring data continued to show the same unusual fluctuations that had originally drawn my attention to the site. But now, they seemed more purposeful, more deliberate. I returned to the site twice more before winter weather made it inaccessible. Each time, I found the thawed rectangle exactly the same size and shape, maintaining its geometric precision, despite normal freeze-thaw cycles that should have altered its boundaries. The temperature readings remained anomalous, showing the same cycling pattern that suggested active thermal regulation rather than passive environmental response. On my final visit in October, I made a discovery that changed how I thought about everything I'd found at that site. While conducting a more thorough search of the area, I found evidence of recent human activity, not just the buried personal items, but signs that someone had been visiting the location regularly over an extended period. There were faint trails leading to the site from multiple directions, worn paths that showed consistent use over years or decades. Hidden among nearby rock formations, I found what appeared to be observation posts where someone could watch the thawed area without being seen. And most disturbing, I found additional caches of personal items, dozens of objects that appeared to be from more recent missing persons cases. Someone had been systematically collecting belongings from people who disappeared in the Alaska wilderness, bringing them to this remote location and burying them in permafrost that they somehow controlled or modified to create perfect storage conditions. The process had been going on for decades, possibly since the 1980s, and it was still continuing. I submitted a supplemental report documenting these additional findings, but by then, the investigation had been transferred to federal authorities, who classified most of the details as part of an ongoing law enforcement matter. I was asked to continue my environmental monitoring work, but to avoid disturbing the site or conducting unauthorized research in the area. I still monitor permafrost conditions throughout the Brooks Range, but I think about that rectangular thaw zone more often than I should. About someone who's been collecting memories from the missing for 40 years, preserving them in frozen ground that defies natural thermal processes. About the families who never learned what happened to their loved ones, whose personal belongings were being curated by someone with purposes we can't understand. The temperature monitoring data from that site continues to show the same anomalous patterns, cycling through warming and cooling phases that maintain perfect preservation conditions for whatever's buried there. Sometimes I wonder how many more items are still being added to the collection. How many more families will never know that pieces of their missing loved ones have found their way to a place where permafrost obeys different rules, and someone unknown keeps careful watch over the accumulated remnants of disappeared lives. I'm Helen Martinez, and I've been supervising park ranger operations in the Yukon Territory for 21 years. In that time, I've seen my share of administrative errors, paperwork mix-ups, and bureaucratic confusion. But in March of 2024, I received a personnel transfer request that made me question everything I thought I understood about how our system works. The paperwork arrived through normal channels, properly formatted and filed according to standard procedures. Ranger Thomas Mitchell was requesting transfer from his current assignment at Kluane Lake Station to the more remote Glacier Bay outpost. Nothing unusual about that. Rangers often request transfers for personal or professional reasons, and Glacier Bay is a challenging assignment that attracts experienced personnel looking for additional responsibility. What made me stare at the paperwork for a long time was that I'd attended Thomas Mitchell's funeral 6 months earlier. Thomas had been working the winter assignment at Glacier Bay in September of 2023 when he'd fallen through unstable ice while conducting routine patrol. His body had been recovered 3 days later by a helicopter rescue team, and we'd held a memorial service that was attended by over 40 Park Service personnel and family members. I'd personally delivered the flag to his sister and had filed the final incident report that officially closed his case. But the transfer request was filled out in Thomas's distinctive handwriting, using the same blue ink pen he'd always preferred, with the same slight rightward slant that made his writing immediately recognizable. Even his signature matched perfectly the quick, efficient scrawl that I'd seen on hundreds of reports and requisitions over the 8 years he'd worked under my supervision. The paperwork was dated March 15th, 2024, and requested assignment to the same Glacier Bay station where Thomas had died. The reason given for the transfer was familiarity with station operations and desire to continue important work in the area. I checked the personnel database, thinking there might be some kind of clerical error or identity confusion. But Thomas Mitchell's status was clearly marked as deceased, line of duty death, September 23rd, 2023. His employee number had been retired, his access credentials had been deactivated, and his final paycheck had been issued to his estate 6 months earlier. I called the personnel office to report what appeared to be a significant administrative error, but they confirmed that the paperwork had been properly submitted through official channels and bore all the required signatures and authorization codes. According to their records, the transfer request was legitimate and complete. The phone number listed on the contact information was one I didn't recognize, not the cell phone number I had on file for Thomas from before his death. But following standard procedure for processing transfer requests, I called to confirm the details and discuss the assignment. Someone answered on the third ring. "Hello, this is Thomas Mitchell," said a voice I recognized immediately. The same tone, the same slight accent that came from growing up in rural Montana. The same professional but friendly manner that Thomas had always maintained during our official conversations. I sat in my office chair, holding the phone and trying to process what I was hearing. "Thomas, this is Helen Martinez. I received your transfer request, but I need to clarify some information in our personnel records." "Of course, Helen. What do you need to know?" The voice was calm, matter-of-fact, showing no awareness that anything unusual was happening. "Our records show some discrepancies regarding your current employment status. Can you confirm your current assignment?" "I've been working independently for the past few months, conducting research in the Glacier Bay area. I'm ready to resume regular duties now, and I'd like to be assigned back to the station where I was working before." I felt like I was having a conversation in a dream, where nothing quite made sense, but everyone was behaving as if everything was normal. "Thomas, I need you to come into the district office so we can sort out these personnel issues in person." "I understand, but I'm currently in the field and won't be able to travel to the office for several weeks. Can we handle the transfer authorization by phone? I'm familiar with all the station protocols, and I'm ready to start work again immediately." There was something in his voice when he said "ready to start work again" that made my chest feel tight. Not eagerness exactly, but a kind of certainty that suggested he'd been preparing for this conversation for a long time. "Thomas, I need to ask you directly. Do you remember what happened at Glacier Bay in September?" A long pause. "There was an accident. I fell through the ice while checking the weather monitoring equipment. It was a mistake I won't make again." "You understand that you were reported as having died in that accident?" Another pause, shorter this time. "I understand that's what the reports say, but I'm obviously still here, and I'd like to get back to work. The station needs someone who knows the area, and I know it better than anyone else now." I ended the call, promising to review his paperwork and get back to him within a few days. Then I spent the rest of the afternoon staring at Thomas Mitchell's personnel file, trying to understand what was happening. I'd known Thomas for 8 years. He'd been a solid, reliable ranger, with excellent knowledge of wilderness safety protocols and a talent for working alone in remote assignment. He'd never shown signs of mental health issues, substance abuse, or other problems that might affect his judgment or performance. And he'd definitely died in that ice accident. I'd seen the body myself during the recovery operation. But someone who sounded exactly like Thomas Mitchell had answered the phone and spoken about returning to work with the kind of detailed knowledge of procedures and locations that would be difficult for an imposter to fake. Whoever I'd spoken with knew about the weather monitoring equipment, knew my name and our working relationship, knew the specific protocols for the Glacier Bay station. I contacted the Alaska State Troopers to report the unusual situation, thinking we might be dealing with identity theft or some kind of elaborate fraud. But when they investigated the phone number, it traced to a satellite phone registered to the Park Service and assigned to the Glacier Bay station, the same phone that had been reported lost when Thomas died. The investigation team reviewed the transfer paperwork and confirmed that the handwriting analysis was consistent with authenticated samples of Thomas Mitchell's writing from his personnel file. The signature matched. The writing style matched. Even small details, like the way he formed certain letters, were identical to documents he'd filed years earlier. But Thomas Mitchell had been dead for 6 months. The official conclusion was that someone with access to Thomas's personal effects and detailed knowledge of his work history was impersonating him for unknown reasons. The transfer request was denied, and the case was referred to federal authorities for investigation of identity fraud and potential theft of government property. But no arrests were ever made, and no explanation was ever found for who had submitted the paperwork or answered that phone call. I retired from the Park Service 8 months later, officially for personal reasons, but really because I couldn't stop thinking about that conversation, about the voice that sounded exactly like Thomas Mitchell asking to return to work at the station where he died, speaking with the kind of certainty that comes from being exactly where you belong. Since retiring, I've kept in touch with some of my former colleagues, and I still hear occasional reports about unusual activity in the Glacier Bay area. Equipment that functions when it should be broken, maintenance tasks that get completed without any record of who did the work, weather reports that are filed from the station even though it's officially unmanned. Sometimes I wonder if Thomas Mitchell really did come back to work, if he found a way to continue the job he'd loved even after dying in the line of duty. I wonder if that remote station finally has the ranger it needs, someone who knows the area better than anyone else and who's committed to staying no matter what the cost. And sometimes, late at night when I'm thinking about the colleagues I've lost over the years, I wonder if dedication to the work can be strong enough to transcend the normal boundaries between employment and death, between what we think is possible and what actually happens in places where people care deeply enough about their responsibilities to find ways to keep fulfilling them